My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been driving long haul for going on 18 years now. People who've never done it think the job is lonely. They're half right. The cab becomes its own kind of world, the hum of the diesel, the white noise of tires on asphalt, the radio fading in and out between stations. After enough years, you stop noticing the silence and start listening to it instead. And I'll tell you something about silence out on those roads. It isn't always empty. I've heard other drivers talk about the strange things they've encountered. Every route has its folklore. On Interstate 40 through New Mexico, veterans will tell you about the figure that walks the median around mile marker 183. Always heading west. Always dressed in a gas station uniform from another decade. The old hands say if your headlights catch him just right, you can see straight through him to the painted line on the other side of the road. Out on Highway 20 in Oregon, there's a stretch they call the dead zone, not because of poor cell reception, though it is terrible there, but because every driver who's run that road more than a dozen times has the same story, a child's voice coming through the CB radio, asking to be picked up and asking for a name you don't recognize. The smart move, they all agree, is to turn the CB off and keep moving. I've listened to these stories over burnt coffee in diners at 2 in the morning and nodded along, half believing, half skeptical, the way you do when something is too specific to dismiss but too strange to fully accept. I thought I was one of the healthy skeptics, the kind of driver who respects the stories without being ruled by them. Then came the winter of 2019 on a run through the mountains of West Virginia, and I became the kind of person who tells the stories instead. It was a Tuesday in early December when my dispatcher, a woman named Carol who has the patience of a saint and the voice of a retired drill sergeant, sent me a load out of Morgantown, headed for a distribution center in Roanoke, Virginia. Manufactured goods appliance parts, the manifest said. Nothing exotic, the kind of cargo that makes up 90% of what I haul. I loaded up, did my pre-trip inspection, and pulled out of the yard around 4 in the afternoon. The plan was to push through and arrive by midnight. Simple enough. The first 2 hours were uneventful. The highway was clear, the weather was cold but dry, and I had a playlist of old country music keeping me company. I was feeling the particular contentment that comes from a loaded truck, a clear road, and a destination. It was around the 6th mile into Corridor H, one of those stretches of mountain highway that cuts through West Virginia's eastern highlands, that things began to shift. It started with the temperature. The heater in my cab was running fine. I checked it before I left and there was nothing wrong with it mechanically. But somewhere past the first tunnel, I noticed my breath was fogging. Not a little, a lot. Like I was outside in the cold, not sitting in a sealed cab with the heat on. I turned the dial up. The air coming from the vents felt warm enough when I held my hand to it, but the cold in the cab didn't ease. It sat there like something had opened a window that wasn't there. I told myself it was the elevation, told myself the temperature sensors were reading the outside air, told myself it was anything rational, and I kept driving. Then I heard the sound from the trailer. Now loads shift. That's normal. You go around a curve too fast, you take a bump wrong, things move. But this wasn't the dull thud of a sliding pallet or the groan of settling freight. This was a rhythmic sound, a slow, deliberate knock. 3 beats, then silence, then 3 more. I pulled onto the shoulder at the first wide spot I found and climbed out. The cold outside hit me like a wall. It was well below freezing, and the wind through those mountain gaps doesn't ask permission. I walked back to the trailer, broke the seal, and swung the doors open. The load was secure, everything exactly as it had been loaded. No shifting, no damage, nothing out of place. I stood there for a moment with my flashlight sweeping the interior, feeling slightly foolish. And then I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up through my jacket. At the very rear of the trailer, near the left door hinge, there was a handprint in the condensation on the metal wall. A human handprint, adult-sized, inside a sealed trailer. I told myself it was from the loading crew. I told myself it was old. I climbed back in my cab, pulled the doors shut, and sat behind the wheel for a full minute without starting the engine, just breathing. Then I started driving again. The knocking didn't come back immediately. For about 40 minutes, everything was quiet, and I started the slow process of convincing myself I'd imagined the worst of it, that the handprint was from the dock workers and the knocking was the trailer's own body flexing in the cold. Then, around 9:15 in the evening, my mirrors caught something. I need to explain what long-haul mirrors are like. They're large, positioned low on either side of the cab, angled to let you see the full length of the trailer and the road behind you. In the dark with your running lights on, you can see the trailer clearly. the reflective tape along the sides, the red glow of your taillights bouncing off the pavement. What I saw in my driver's side mirror was a shape standing at the very rear of my trailer. Not walking, not running, standing, like someone hitching a ride on the bumper guard, except my trailer doesn't have a bumper guard you can stand on. I looked again, nothing there. I kept my eyes forward. I breathed. I reached for the CB and checked in with another driver a few miles ahead, a guy named Pete who ran that corridor regularly, just to hear another voice. He came back, gave me a weather update for the Virginia border and signed off. Normal, completely normal. But when I glanced at the mirror again, the shape was back. This time I pulled over properly onto an overlook meant for people to stop and photograph the valley in the daytime. I grabbed my flashlight and walked the full length of the trailer. Nothing on the bumper guard, nothing on the undercarriage, no footprints in the thin crust of frost on the asphalt beside the rig. I banged on the trailer walls, nothing responded. When I got back in the cab and looked in my mirror, there was a man sitting in my passenger seat. I want to be precise about what I mean because it matters. He wasn't fully solid. He was the way a reflection is sometimes, when the light is wrong, present enough to see clearly, but with something missing from the edges of him. He was wearing a canvas work jacket, the kind with the corduroy collar. He was maybe in his mid-50s. His face was turned toward the road ahead, as if he was simply a passenger watching where we were going. I didn't scream. I've thought about this a lot since, and I think the reason I didn't scream is that he didn't feel threatening in that first instant. He felt lost. I know how that sounds. "This is my truck," I said, because it was the only thing I could think to say. He didn't respond, didn't turn his head, just kept looking forward. I opened the driver's door and I got out and I stood in the cold mountain air for a solid 5 minutes, and when I got back in, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, but it was cold. Not ambient temperature cold. Cold the way a seat gets after someone has been sitting in it and then got up. I drove the rest of that run white-knuckled and in silence. When I got home, I did what any reasonable person does with an experience they can't explain. I tried very hard to forget it. I slept badly for a few nights, told myself it was fatigue-induced hypnagogia, something I'd read about once, the brain producing images in that threshold state between waking and sleeping. It can happen while driving. It can feel real. But 3 weeks later, Carol sent me another load out of the same yard in Morgantown. This time, a dock worker named Felipe caught me doing my pre-trip inspection and asked me if I'd had any trouble with the trailer on my last run. He said it carefully, the way people ask questions they already know the answer to. I told him about the knocking. I left out the rest. Felipe nodded slowly and said something I wasn't expecting. "That's the third time someone has said that about trailer 1147. He told me what he knew, which wasn't much, but it was enough. 2 years earlier, a driver who regularly hauled out of that yard had died on Corridor H. His name was Dennis Greer. He'd had a medical event, a cardiac episode, the report said, and the truck had drifted off the road in the early morning hours. He was 61 years old and had been driving that exact mountain route for most of his adult life. The trailer he'd been pulling at the time of his death was 1147. I stood there in the cold yard and felt the shape of it settle over me. "Does anyone know why the trailer stays in service?" I asked. Felipe shrugged. "It's just a trailer," he said. "You can't retire a trailer because of that." He was right, of course. You can't. I want to be honest about what I did next because I've gone back and forth about whether it was the right thing. I drove Corridor H again, on purpose, not out of bravado. I'm not that kind of man. I did it because I had a theory, and the only way to test it was to go back. The theory was simple. Dennis Greer had died on that road and in that trailer, in the dark, and whatever was left of him, whatever impression or echo a person leaves behind when they go suddenly and violently and alone, it was still there, still riding the route he'd spent his life on, still watching the road. The run was nearly identical to the first one. Same time of year, same cargo type, same departure time. I pulled out of Morgantown in the late afternoon and climbed into the mountains as the light failed. I didn't turn on music this time. Around mile marker 27, where the road dips into a narrow cut between two ridgelines, the cab went cold. I kept my hands on the wheel and my eyes forward. "Mr. Greer," I said out loud to the empty passenger seat, "I know what happened to you on this road. I know you ran this corridor for a long time. I looked you up. You drove for 26 years without a single accident. You were good at this." The cold deepened. "You're not being forgotten. Your family knows what happened. Your daughter gave a statement to the local paper. She called you a man who loved his work. I'd read that. I'd found the obituary and the small article in the Morgantown paper from 2 years prior. I'd read it 3 times. The cold began to ease, slowly, the way a room warms when someone opens a vent that's been closed too long. I drove the rest of Corridor H in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the empty kind, not the waiting kind. The kind that comes after something has been said that needed to be said. When I checked my mirrors at the Virginia state line, they showed me nothing but the road behind me and the last pale strip of sky above the ridgeline. I delivered the load to Roanoke without incident. I've hauled out of that Morgantown yard 4 times since then. Carol keeps sending me there because I've got a clean record on the corridor and the timing works out for my routes. The first time I went back after that second run, I asked about trailer 1147 almost without thinking. The yard manager told me it had been pulled from service, not for anything supernatural, a structural issue with the rear frame, discovered during a DOT inspection. It was sitting in the back of the lot waiting to be assessed for repair or salvage. I walked back there and looked at it, just stood beside it for a minute in the cold. There's nothing mystical I can tell you about that moment. It was a battered grey trailer with a cracked rear light housing and some rust starting at the lower seams. It looked like what it was, a piece of equipment that had logged several 100,000 miles and was starting to show them. But I put my hand flat against the metal side, the way I had imagined that handprint on the interior wall, and I said quietly, "You can stop now. I'm not a religious man. I'm not particularly given to ceremony or sentiment. I drive for a living and I pay my bills and I watch the road. But I have thought about Dennis Greer almost every time I've passed through those mountains since. I've thought about what it means to spend your life on a road. Really spend it, the way long-haul drivers do, the way the miles become more familiar than most living rooms, the way you know the curves and the grades and the places where the fog comes down before you can see it. I've thought about how strange it must be to leave a road like that without meaning to. Other drivers have their stories. The woman in white on Route 66, the hitchhiker frozen in 1969, the bridge that bends time, and I have mine, a man in a canvas work jacket, riding passenger on a route he knew better than anyone, watching the headlights cut through the dark between the West Virginia ridges. Still doing what he always did, still driving through. We continue. My grandfather used to say that the highway never sleeps, it just changes shifts. He meant it literally. During the day it belongs to commerce, cattle trucks, fuel tankers, families on their way to somewhere better. But at night, he said, something else takes the wheel. I used to think he was talking poetically, the way old men do when they want to sound wise without actually saying anything. I don't think that anymore. My name is Daniel Cruz. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 11 years, I've worked overnight dispatch for Meridian Freight out of Odessa, Texas. I appreciate everyone who takes the time to listen to this podcast. I know most of you tune in for these kinds of stories, and I want to be clear from the start. What I'm about to tell you is not something I've embellished or dramatized. I'm a practical man. I track cargo manifests and driver ETAs for a living. I deal in facts, in tonnage, in GPS coordinates, which is exactly why what happened to me that summer is so difficult to reconcile even now. It started with a good deed, or what I thought was one at the time. The summer I'm talking about was 2 years ago, July, when the Permian Basin turns into something that feels genuinely hostile to human life. The air smells like crude oil and the horizon shimmers like the ground is trying to peel itself back. I was working the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. slot, same as always, sitting in our dispatch office, a converted double-wide trailer parked behind the main lot, monitoring feeds, talking drivers through way station backups, the usual. It was a Tuesday, which meant light traffic, which meant long stretches of silence between radio check-ins. Around 1 a.m., I got a call from one of our regular drivers, Marcus Webb. Marcus ran the eastern route, a long haul from Odessa out to Pecos and back, and he'd been driving for Meridian for about 6 years. I'd spoken to him hundreds of times. Steady voice, never rattled, the kind of man who made dispatch work feel easy because you knew he wasn't going to do anything stupid. "Denny, I got a situation," he said. His voice was different, not panicked, but careful in a way that felt deliberate, like he was choosing every word. "Talk to me, Marcus. Where are you?" "Mile marker 9 eastbound. I've got a man on the shoulder." I pulled up the GPS overlay. He was right where he said, on a particularly isolated stretch of 20, the kind of road where the nearest town is a gas station that might or might not still be open. Is he hurt? He doesn't look hurt. He's just standing there. He flagged me down. He's Danny. He's an old man. He's wearing a suit out here at 1 a.m. I told Marcus to use his judgment that we weren't technically obligated to stop for anyone, but also that leaving an elderly man stranded on the side of a highway in July at 1 a.m. was its own kind of problem. Marcus decided to stop. I told him to keep the radio open and to leave his hazards on, and I stayed on the line. What Marcus described over the next few minutes was strange in a small, almost dismissible way. The man was indeed elderly. He told Marcus he was 78, and he was wearing a dark suit that Marcus described as old-fashioned, like from a photograph. He had no cell phone, no wallet, no bags of any kind. He said his name was Raymond, and that he'd been trying to reach a town called Grand Falls, about 40 miles east. He's not confused, Marcus told me quietly. He knows exactly where he is. He's got no explanation for how he ended up here. He says he was at a family gathering and then he was here. I told Marcus to get the man's information and we'd call it in to the county. Marcus agreed. I heard him talking to the old man, heard a low, measured response, and then silence. Then Marcus came back on. He doesn't want us to call anyone, Marcus said. He says he just needs to get to Grand Falls. He says someone is waiting for him there. Against my better judgment, against every protocol Meridian had for exactly this kind of situation, I told Marcus that it was his call, and Marcus, being Marcus, said he'd take the man as far as the Grand Falls exit and drop him somewhere visible. I noted the time, 1:14 a.m. At 2:08 a.m., Marcus checked back in. He sounded different. I dropped him off, he said, at the exit like I said I would. Danny, when I pulled over and he got out of the truck, I turned to watch him walk away, just to make sure he was okay, you know? And he walked about 20 feet. I could see him in the side mirror. And then he wasn't there. Wasn't there? I repeated. There's nothing out there, man. No trees, no buildings, no cars. He just walked 20 feet and he was gone. I told Marcus it was probably the lighting, that he was tired, that desert mirages weren't just a daytime phenomenon. Marcus didn't argue. He drove the rest of his route in silence, and when he came back in at 5 a.m., he didn't mention the old man at all. Neither did I. We filed nothing. There was nothing to file. One driver stopped to help a stranger and gave him a ride. That was all. I forgot about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, I started having trouble sleeping. Now, I want to be precise here because I think precision matters when you're trying to communicate something that sounds inherently imprecise. I didn't stop sleeping. I wasn't having nightmares. What was happening was more subtle and in some ways more disturbing, and I would fall asleep normally and wake up 8 hours later feeling as though I hadn't slept at all. More than that, I'd wake up feeling as though something had been present in the room while I slept. Not threatening exactly, just present, watching. My apartment is on the 2nd floor of a building that backs up against a chain-link fence. There's a sodium lamp about 30 feet from my bedroom window that casts a dull orange light across the ceiling when the blinds are thin enough. I'd never noticed it before. I noticed it now. I'd lie there and stare at the orange stripe across my ceiling and feel, with absolute certainty, that something was standing just outside my field of vision. By the end of the first week, I started leaving lights on. Not because I was afraid of the dark. I hadn't been afraid of the dark since I was 7 years old, but because the darkness in my apartment had started to feel occupied. I told myself it was the heat. July in West Texas will do strange things to a person's sleep. I told myself it was the shift work catching up with me, that after 11 years of overnight hours, your nervous system starts to register wakefulness and sleep as interchangeable. I told myself a lot of things. Then Marcus called in sick. This wasn't unusual. Marcus had called in sick maybe twice in 6 years, always with a quick and apologetic explanation. This time he didn't give one. He just said he wasn't coming in. He sounded hollow, which is the only word I can think of. Like someone had reached inside him and removed about 20% of whatever makes a person sound like themselves. I called him back after my shift. He picked up after a long time. I've been seeing him, Marcus said without me asking anything. The old man. I waited. Not outside, in my head. When I close my eyes, he's just standing there like he was on the highway. Except now he's in my house, in my yard, at the end of my driveway, and he's just watching. Marcus, you need to sleep, I said. You need to see a doctor. I know what you're going to say, he said. I'd say the same thing. But Danny, I went back out to mile marker 9. I don't know why, I just felt like I needed to go. And there was something on the shoulder of the road. He paused for a long time. It was a shoe, he said, an old-fashioned dress shoe, just one, right where he was standing when I pulled over. I didn't say anything to that. I left it there, Marcus said. I didn't want to touch it. We hung up. I sat in the parking lot of my apartment complex for a while, engine running, air conditioning on full. I thought about what he said. I thought about the orange light on my ceiling. I thought about the specific quality of the watching presence I'd been feeling in my apartment, patient, undemanding but insistent in the way that a debt is insistent. It doesn't threaten you. It just exists and you know it's there, and you know eventually you'll have to deal with it. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my mother. My mother is a woman of deep and particular faith, the kind that was built slowly through hard years and genuine personal losses, and came out the other side not as certainty but as trust. She grew up in a small town in East Tennessee where her grandmother kept a Bible in every room of the house and knew the names of things not in the way people use that phrase casually, but in the specific old country sense of knowing what to call what had gotten into a place or a person. My mother had absorbed some of that without fully subscribing to it. She was practical like me, but she also knew when practical wasn't enough. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is something she does when she thinks a situation is serious. The man disappeared, she said when I finished. That's what Marcus said. And you've been feeling watched since the same week? Yes. And Marcus is seeing him. He says so. A long pause. Daniel, listen to me. That man was not a man who needed help. He was a man who needed to find someone willing to give it. What does that mean? She took her time answering. When I was a little girl, my grandmother told me about things that get left between places. People who die the wrong way suddenly, violently, without being ready sometimes can't find their way through, and sometimes they try to use a living person to anchor themselves. They look for someone good, someone willing, because those are the ones who leave the door open long enough for them to slip through. I asked her what that meant practically, what I was supposed to do with that information. You need to close the door, she said. She told me what her grandmother had done when something like this had happened years ago in her town. There were specific things, old things, the kind that have been documented in various forms across cultures and centuries, the kind that anthropologists write about without quite deciding whether to take them seriously. I won't go into all the details because I think some of what she told me is private in a way that's hard to explain, but the core of it was this. You cannot simply ignore something that has attached itself to you. Ignoring it is not neutrality. Ignoring it is consent by neglect. I didn't go to sleep that night. Instead, I drove out to mile marker 9. I want to explain why, because even now it sounds like exactly the wrong thing to do. But there was a logic to it that made sense at 3 a.m. in a way it maybe doesn't in daylight. If something had started with that stretch of road, then maybe that was also where it needed to end. I had Marcus's description of where the old man had been standing. I had a general sense of what I was there to do, which was not to find anything but to say something out loud clearly to whatever was using that location as a kind of waypoint. The highway was empty. I put my hazards on out of pure reflex and got out of the car. The heat was still incredible even at that hour, the kind of heat that wraps around you and makes the darkness feel thick. I walked to the shoulder, about where Marcus said the man had been standing. There was still a shoe there. I'm not going to tell you I touched it. I didn't. I stood about 10 feet from it and looked at it, and it was exactly what Marcus described. A single dark dress shoe, old-fashioned, the kind with a leather sole and small eyelets. It had been there for a week in July heat, and it looked like it had been placed there 5 minutes ago. I said what I came to say. I don't know the exact right words for what it was, a request, a command, a closing statement. What I said was something like, whatever you need from this road, it's not here anymore. Whatever you're looking for, I don't have it. You need to keep moving. I meant it. That sounds like a small thing, but I think it matters. I have been told, and I believe it. That intention carries weight in ways we don't fully understand. I drove home and went to sleep. I slept for 9 hours, which was about 3 more than I normally managed. When I woke up, the room was just a room. The orange light on the ceiling was just a sodium lamp through thin blinds. Whatever had been standing at the edge of my perception for the past 2 weeks was gone. Marcus came back to work 2 days later. He didn't bring up the highway or the old man. I didn't either. We slipped back into the rhythm of dispatch work, cargo manifests, way station backups, driver ETAs, the way you slip back into a familiar pattern after a disruption, half grateful and half unable to fully trust that things have gone back to normal. A month later, I was doing a routine check of county accident records as part of my job, keeping an eye on road conditions and incident reports for the routes we use, and I found something in the July records. A brief entry about 2 weeks before Marcus picked up the stranger at mile marker 9. A pedestrian fatality, eastbound on 20, near mile marker 9. The description was spared the way county records are. Elderly male, unidentified at time of report, formal attire. Cause of death, vehicle collision. There was a follow-up note. He'd been identified eventually through a distant family member. His name was Raymond Alcott. He'd been on his way to visit someone in Grand Falls. I sat with that for a long time. Marcus picked up a man at mile marker 9 at 1 a.m. in July. He gave that man a ride. The man disappeared from the shoulder of the road in a place with nowhere to go. His shoe stayed behind. His name was Raymond Alcott, and he died on that same stretch of road 2 weeks earlier, trying to get to Grand Falls. I don't know what to make of it, even now. I've turned it over from every angle I know how to approach. The rational part of my mind, the dispatch coordinator part, the man who deals in facts and tonnage and GPS coordinates, keeps trying to find the seam where this comes apart into something explainable. It hasn't found it. What I keep coming back to is this. Marcus stopped because he thought it was the right thing to do. Raymond Alcott had been wandering that stretch of highway for 2 weeks, and Marcus was the first person who stopped. And maybe that act of decency, pulling over for an old man in a suit at 1 a.m., was exactly the thing that let Raymond get close enough to latch on. The kindness was the opening. My grandfather said the highway changes shifts at night. I think now he understood more than he was letting on. What I'll tell you, and I mean this as plainly as I know how to say it, if you drive long stretches of highway at night and you see someone standing on the shoulder looking like they need help, trust your instincts, not your compassion, your instincts. Those two things are not always pointing in the same direction. And out there in the dark, past the last lit sign between one town and the next, the difference between those two things can matter more than you'd expect. Marcus transferred to a day route in September. He said it was for personal reasons. I filed the paperwork without asking questions. I still work nights. I don't know if I'll stop. The highway needs someone to watch it, and I figure if I'm already there, I might as well be paying attention. Just not at mile marker 9. I route our drivers around that stretch when I can. I don't think Raymond Alcott is still there, but I also don't know where he went. And those, I've come to understand, are two very different things. We continue. The night I decided to finally talk about this, I sat in my truck for 40 minutes with the engine running before I walked back inside. I'm not someone who hesitates. Anyone who has served with me would laugh at that idea. But some things take time before your mouth is willing to form the words your brain has been carrying for years. My name is Aaron Calloway. I spent 11 years as a signals intelligence analyst with the United States Army SIGINT, for those unfamiliar. My job was to intercept, decode, and interpret electronic communications, enemy radio traffic, encrypted transmissions, frequency anomalies, drone telemetry. I was what some people casually call a ghost. I sat in a room, listened to things no one was supposed to say out loud, and translated silence into actionable intelligence. I was good at it, exceptionally good, and I say that not out of arrogance but because context matters here. When I tell you what I heard, I need you to understand that I am not someone who mishears things. I am not someone who imagines signal where there is none. My entire career was built on distinguishing the real from the noise. What happened at Grid Zero, that's what we internally called the site. It was never its official designation. What happened there fundamentally broke something in how I understand the world to work. I've been debating telling this story publicly for about 3 years. The only reason I'm doing it now is that 2 of the people who were there with me have already told pieces of it separately to different people in different ways, and I'd rather give you the complete picture than let fragments circulate without the connective tissue that makes them make sense, or as close to sense as anything about that place ever made. This happened roughly 7 years ago. I was stationed at a forward operating base in a region I won't specify, not because I'm being coy, but because the country's government would dispute that we were ever there. And that dispute is something I'm choosing not to involve myself in. What I will say is that it was remote, mountainous, and that the communications infrastructure in the area was practically non-existent by modern standards. That last part was ostensibly why we were there. A signals team had been picking up a recurring transmission on a frequency that shouldn't have had anything broadcasting on it. I want to explain what that means for people who aren't familiar with radio operations. Every frequency on the electromagnetic spectrum has either an authorized user or a physical explanation for any signal found there. Natural interference from weather, solar activity, terrain, these are documented, predictable, and identifiable. Unauthorized human transmissions stand out immediately because they have structure, pattern. The hiss of static doesn't repeat in a sequence. Human communication does. This particular signal had been flagged twice in a 6-week period. Both times it lasted between 40 and 90 seconds. Then vanished completely. When our analysts ran spectral analysis on the recordings, they identified characteristics consistent with a voice transmission but heavily degraded, like a tape recording played back through damaged equipment. There was no decipherable language, no coordinates embedded in the signal, and nothing actionable. Normally something like that would be logged and monitored. Anomalies get tracked. But the reason a full team was dispatched, the reason I was pulled from my current assignment and told to pack for a cold weather deployment, was the third transmission. The third one lasted 9 minutes, and somewhere inside it, clear enough that 3 independent analysts confirmed it without being told what to listen for, was a numerical sequence that corresponded to the coordinates of our base, not the forward operating base I was currently stationed at, a different one, a base that, at the time of the transmission, had been decommissioned and physically demolished 18 months prior. Someone or something was broadcasting the coordinates of a facility that no longer existed on a frequency reserved, theoretically, for emergency military use from a location that our triangulation suggested was a stretch of uninhabited high-altitude terrain that our own maps marked as impassable. I want to be precise here because I know how this sounds. I know that people hear stories like this and immediately reach for comfortable explanations. Rogue signal equipment left behind, automated transmission loop on a malfunctioning device, atmospheric skip causing a distant signal to bounce in unexpected ways. I reached for all of those explanations myself. Our team reached for them. The reason we were being sent on foot into those mountains instead of simply logging the anomaly is that the people above my pay grade had already exhausted those explanations and found them insufficient. We deployed on a Thursday, 6 of us, myself, a senior analyst named Priya, who I'd worked alongside for 4 years, 2 infantry escorts, a communications tech named Douglas, and our team lead, a lieutenant colonel I'll call Wheeler because that was in fact his name, and he passed away 2 years after this deployment from causes entirely unrelated to what I'm about to describe. I mention him because he deserves to be acknowledged. He was a methodical, steady man who did not rattle easily, and what he said to me on the helicopter ride up into those mountains has stayed with me since. He leaned over and said close enough to my ear that only I could hear him over the rotors, "Calloway, whatever we find up there, our job is to document it, not to understand it, document it." At the time I thought that was just Wheeler being Wheeler, thorough, procedural, mission-focused. Later I came to believe he was saying something else entirely, that he already had reason to expect that understanding might not be an option. The insertion point was roughly 2 kilometers from the target coordinates. We moved on foot through terrain that was technically impassable and practically just extremely unpleasant. Loose shale elevation gain that made every step feel like 3. Temperature dropping the further we climbed. By the time we reached the area the triangulation had identified, we were operating in near darkness with headlamps and a half moon that kept disappearing behind cloud cover. There was nothing there. That was the first thing. No structure, no equipment, no visible antenna array or transmission hardware of any kind. Just a flat, rocky shelf of high ground with a clear view of the valley below, and, on 3 sides, steep drops that would have required serious technical climbing gear to approach from below. Douglas set up the portable monitoring equipment while Priya and I did a physical sweep of the area. The infantry escorts held the perimeter. Wheeler stood at the center of the shelf watching the equipment as it warmed up. I want to describe what it felt like up there because I think the atmosphere of a place matters not in a supernatural sense, but in the sense that human beings have evolved to read environments and that instinct is worth paying attention to. That shelf of rock felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately quantify. It was too quiet, I don't mean the kind of quiet you'd expect at altitude in a remote location. I mean that the wind, which had been constant and bitter during the approach, simply stopped the moment we stepped onto that flat ground. The temperature dropped perceptibly, and there was a smell that I can only describe as ozone, the same sharp metallic quality you get after lightning strikes nearby, despite the fact that the sky was clear and there had been no electrical storm. Priya noticed it too. She looked at me, and I saw something in her expression that I rarely saw from her. She was someone who processed information quickly and moved on. She wasn't moving on. She was standing still, scanning the area, and I could tell she was doing the same thing I was doing, trying to locate the source of a feeling she couldn't yet name. Douglas had the equipment running inside of 12 minutes. The standard procedure was to establish a monitoring window, and wait transmissions at this frequency weren't predictable, and there was no guarantee we'd capture anything during our time on site. Wheeler gave us a 2-hour window before we would need to begin the descent to make the extraction point before daylight. The first hour was uneventful. We documented the site, took soil and surface samples, ran a sweep for buried hardware that might explain a buried antenna, nothing. Douglas monitored the equipment. The infantry kept a perimeter. The cloud cover came and went across the moon. Priya sat near the equipment and made notes in her field log. I walked the edges of the shelf, doing a secondary physical survey and trying to identify anything we'd missed. That was when I found the writing. It was on the underside of a flat rock near the eastern edge of the shelf, not carved or painted but scratched, as if with a sharp piece of metal or stone. I had to angle my headlamp precisely to read it. It was a series of numbers. Frequency values. I recognized immediately. The formatting was familiar, the same notation system we used in our own field logs. There were 11 frequencies listed. I photographed them and radioed Wheeler. He came to look. He stood over that rock for a long moment, reading the numbers twice, and then he turned to me and said quietly, 7 of these are active military frequencies, classified. They shouldn't be documented anywhere outside a secured facility. The implication settled over both of us without either of us needing to say it aloud. Someone with security clearance had been at this location. Someone with access to classified operational frequencies had sat on this rock in this impassable location and written those numbers on the underside of a stone. I was about to respond when Douglas's voice came over the radio. "Sir, it's transmitting." We moved back to the monitoring station and crowded around the equipment. The signal was there, the same frequency, the same degraded quality the recordings had captured. But this time, with our equipment physically present at the source coordinates rather than triangulating from a distance, the resolution was significantly higher. It was a voice that was now beyond dispute. The acoustic profile was consistent with a human male, adult speaking at a measured pace. The degradation was severe enough that individual words were still not clearly distinguishable, but Priya, who had a gift for this kind of auditory analysis, started quietly repeating syllables she was pulling from the noise, patterns she was identifying. Then Douglas said, "It's getting cleaner." And he was right. Slowly, over the course of approximately 90 seconds, the signal quality began to improve, as if the source was getting closer, as if whatever was transmitting was moving toward us. By the time it was clear enough to understand, the signal had been running for just over 4 minutes. Wheeler had his hand recorder out. All 6 of us were standing within arm's reach of the monitoring station, completely still. The voice said, in English, calm and deliberate and with no ambient background noise whatsoever, a sequence of names, 8 names, first and last, spoken with complete clarity, one after another with a brief pause between each. The 5th name was Wheeler's, the 7th was mine. I have thought about that moment almost every day for 7 years, and I still cannot fully account for what I felt. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something more disorienting than fear. Fear implies a threat you can identify and respond to. What I felt was a complete suspension of the framework I use to make sense of information, because names don't spontaneously appear in a radio transmission. Someone chose those names. Someone knew to say them in that order, at that moment, in that location. Wheeler, to his considerable credit, did not freeze. He immediately told Douglas to run a full capture and instructed the escorts to sweep the perimeter on the double. He radioed the situation to base. Then he turned to the rest of us, face completely composed, and said, "We're documenting this, everybody stay tight." The transmission continued for another 3 minutes. After the names, it shifted back to the degraded, indistinct quality of the earlier recordings. Priya kept pulling syllables. I was watching the monitoring equipment and trying to stay in the professional mindset that Wheeler was visibly modeling for all of us. Then the equipment went dark, not a power failure, I want to be precise. The battery indicator was at full capacity, the hardware was intact. The monitoring station simply ceased to receive any signal whatsoever, as if something had placed a physical barrier between us and the electromagnetic spectrum itself. Douglas went through every diagnostic in sequence. Nothing was wrong with the equipment. The frequency was empty. The escorts reported nothing on the perimeter. No thermal signatures, no sound, no movement. The flat rock shelf around us was completely undisturbed. We made the extraction point with 40 minutes to spare. Nobody spoke on the helicopter back, not because we'd been ordered not to, but because I don't think any of us had yet found the words. The debrief took 2 days. What I was told at the end of it was that the recording would be analyzed, the site would be put under remote monitoring, and that the details of the deployment were classified pending review. I signed the appropriate documentation. I was thanked for my professionalism. 2 weeks later, I was informed that the recording from the monitoring station was unrecoverable. Hardware malfunctioned the same session during which the equipment had gone completely dark. The only documentation that survived was Wheeler's hand recorder, which captured approximately 90 seconds of audio before the battery died. Those 90 seconds covered the names. I was allowed to listen to the recording once in a supervised setting, and then it was logged as classified material. I can tell you that the voice on the recording sounded like a man who was not afraid. It sounded like a man who was reading something he had read before. And I can tell you that when the 7th name came, my name, in that voice, in that recording, every part of my training told me to approach it analytically, to log it, to document rather than to understand. I'm not sure I've successfully managed either one. 3 of the other names on the transmission I didn't recognize. Wheeler I've told you about. The remaining 3 I looked into, quietly. Over the following years, nothing official. Nothing that would raise flags. Of the 8 names spoken on that frequency, on that mountain, on that night, 6 of us were verifiably present at the site. I've never determined who the other 2 names belong to. Priya transferred out of SIGINT within the year. She's in private sector now. We've spoken twice since the deployment briefly, and both times she moved off the subject faster than I would have expected from someone who was otherwise exceptional at sitting with difficult data. I still work in intelligence, different capacity, different location. Every day I work with frequencies, with signal and noise, with the fundamental principle that information doesn't appear from nowhere, that there is always a source, always an origin point, always if you have the right equipment and the right training and enough patience, an explanation. I have spent 7 years looking for the explanation. I have not found it. What I have found is this. The frequency we monitored that night had no documented user, no authorized broadcaster, no physical infrastructure capable of producing a signal of that quality from that location, and the voice on the transmission, calm, deliberate, speaking names it had no legitimate means of knowing, has never been identified. Wheeler said our job was to document it and not to understand it. I'm documenting it now. I just wish I understood why my name was on that list. We continue. My name is Caleb Morse, and I've worked as a fire lookout for the U.S. Forest Service for the better part of 9 years. When I tell people what I do, they usually say something like, "Oh, that sounds peaceful," or "must be nice, just sitting up there watching mountains all day." And they're not entirely wrong. There is a real beauty to it. But it's also the kind of job that teaches you what it means to be genuinely, completely alone. Not in the poetic sense, but in the way that strips away every distraction you've ever used to avoid your own mind. I came to this work after leaving emergency medicine. I spent 8 years as a paramedic in Spokane. I won't get into the details of why I left, that's a different kind of story. But I'll say that after nearly a decade of that kind of work, I needed something that put distance between me and other people for a while. Not because I stopped caring about them. If anything, the opposite. Fire lookout duty gave me that distance, literally. The tower where I worked for most of my seasons sits at 5,820 feet on the eastern ridgeline of the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest in north-central Washington state. The Forest Service calls it Ridgeline Station. The locals, what few there are out in that terrain, call it the Ghost Perch. I always assumed that name came from the cloud cover. The tower gets socked in so often that from the valley below you can barely see it for weeks at a time. I don't assume that anymore. A typical season runs from late June through mid-October. You rotate in by ATV once a week with supplies. You have a radio, a pair of binoculars, a rotating Osborne firefinder, a compass mounted over a topographic map that lets you triangulate the location of any smoke you spot and your own company. That's the entire inventory of your world for 4 months. I loved it. What I'm going to tell you happened during my 7th season, the summer of 2019. It began so quietly that I nearly dismissed it altogether. The first time was the night of July 14th and approximately 2:10 in the morning. I woke up for no reason I could name. This wasn't unusual. When you sleep at altitude with no ambient sound except wind and the occasional northern pygmy owl, your body develops a particular sensitivity to changes in the environment. A shift in barometric pressure, a temperature gradient, something your nervous system reads before your conscious mind has any idea what it's responding to. I got up and moved to the south-facing windows out of habit, the way I always did when I woke in the night, just to scan the tree line. The Osborne was centered, the air was still. A half-moon hung to the southwest and gave the ridge a grey mineral quality I always found more beautiful than daylight. And that's when I saw it. About a quarter mile down the slope, in a stretch of old-growth Douglas fir where I knew for a fact there were no trails, there was a light. A soft, pale white light moving slowly through the trees. My first thought was completely rational. A hiker with a headlamp, someone who had wandered off the Shelland Summit Trail, which runs about half a mile to the east. Lost hikers are not uncommon in that terrain, especially in July when day trippers underestimate the distance to the ridge. I reached for my binoculars. The light didn't move the way a headlamp does. A headlamp bobs and swings with the rhythm of a person walking. It throws a directed beam wherever the person is looking. This light was different. It was diffuse, a uniform, soft glow with no concentrated point source. And it didn't bob. It drifted slowly, steadily, with no variation in brightness, like a paper lantern floating on still water. I watched it for approximately 40 minutes. It covered maybe 200 yards of ground in that time, moving laterally along the tree line and then simply faded. Not turned off, faded the way a coal fades when you stop feeding it air. I noted it in my log, 210. Unknown light source, south slope, movement pattern inconsistent with human carrier, duration approximately 40 minutes, faded, not extinguished. Then I went back to sleep. The following morning I radioed the observation to base coordinator Donna Hecht, who had been managing this district's lookout rotation for close to 15 years. She was a practical woman in her mid-50s with the clipped and efficient manner of someone who had heard every unusual field report there was and learned to give none of them more or less weight than they deserved. Could be ball lightning, she said, or bioluminescent fungi. It happens in old growth more than people realize. Note it and keep watching. If it persists, we'll have someone hike up to check the area. I agreed that was the right call, logged the conversation, and that was that. For the next 12 days, nothing happened. I almost forgot about it. It was back on the night of July 28th, at approximately 1:45 in the morning. Same area of the slope, same diffuse pale glow, but closer this time, perhaps 150 yards from the base of the tower, working its way through a section of forest where the old growth thinned before giving way to the talus field at the foot of the ridge. I radioed Donna immediately. Same light as the 14th. I told her. It's closer to the tower tonight. How close? She asked. 150 yards, maybe a little less. A pause. Caleb, you're not going down there. No, I said. I'm not. What I didn't tell Donna was the part that was genuinely disturbing me, because the light wasn't just closer, it was responding to me. When I moved to the north-facing window, the light drifted north along the tree line. When I moved back to the south window, it corrected its course and drifted south. I tested this half a dozen times, moving back and forth between windows, and each time the light adjusted its position to remain roughly centered beneath where I stood. After about 20 minutes of this, I positioned myself at the center of the cabin and watched through the south window without moving. The light went still, just floated there, stationary, at the edge of the tree line. The two of us watching each other across 150 yards of dark timber. Then slowly, it began drifting toward the tower. I'm not a man who panics easily. I want to be clear about that. But what I did next is something I'm not particularly proud of. I switched off the interior cabin light, dropped below the windowsill, and lay flat on the floor in the dark for nearly 10 minutes, listening to the wind in the antenna cables. When I finally got back up and looked, the light was gone. I sat at my desk and stared at my logbook for a long time. I wasn't sure what to write. Eventually I put, "Light returned. Appeared to track observer's position within cabin. Advanced toward tower perimeter before observation was terminated at 02:22. That was the night I decided to call Felix. Felix Darden had been working the Lone Ridge Tower, 12 miles north of my position, for 4 seasons. He was 10 years older than me, former Navy, with that quality some military veterans have of being simultaneously very relaxed and very alert. A composure that reads as ease until something actually happens, and then you understand it was disciplined the entire time. He was good on the radio, never dramatic, always precise. In all the time I'd known him, I had never once heard him report something he wasn't certain of. I reached him the following morning on the direct channel. "I need to ask you something," I said. "And I want you to answer honestly, not the way we'd answer on the base frequency." A brief silence. "Go ahead." "Have you seen anything at night? In the trees below the tower, lights that don't have a good explanation?" Another silence, longer. Then, "What kind of lights?" "Soft, white, no beam, no point source, drifts through the timber like something floating." The pause that followed was the longest of all. "Yes," he said finally. 3 times I logged it as possible bioluminescence." "Did you actually believe that?" "No," he said, "I did not." We talked for nearly an hour. His sightings had begun in the 2nd week of July, the same time frame as mine. The behavior of the light was identical. Slow drift through the trees, diffuse with no directional quality, apparently tracking his position inside the tower. He had not seen it approach the base directly, but on his 3rd sighting it had moved to within what he estimated was 50 yards, before he lost visual in a patch of ground fog. "I didn't file anything beyond the standard observation note," he said. "I thought if I pushed it, they'd pull me from rotation for a psychological evaluation." "Same reason I didn't push it," I said. "What do you think it is?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately because I wasn't sure I wanted to say it out loud. "I don't know," I finally told him, "but it knows we're up here." Felix went quiet for a long moment. "If I see it again," he said, "I'll call you direct before I radio base." "Same," I said. The 3rd sighting came on August 9th, a Saturday, and it was approximately 3:30 in the morning, and I was asleep when it arrived. I woke the way I had on July 14th. No particular stimulus, just suddenly and completely alert. I lay in my sleeping bag for about 30 seconds listening. The wind had died. That was what was wrong. At 5,820 feet in the Cascades in early August, the wind does not simply die. There is always some movement through the antenna cables, some sound in the eaves of the cab. The silence that night was total, and it pressed against the cabin windows like something with weight. I got up and looked south. The light was at the base of the tower, directly below me. I have no explanation for how I had slept through it crossing the Taylor's Field, because that stretch of loose granite makes noise in wind even at a whisper. But it was there, a soft, concentrated glow at the foot of the steel lattice structure, maybe 6 feet in diameter when I looked straight down through the plexiglass viewing panel in the catwalk floor. It was perfectly circular from above, pure white, no flicker, no heat shimmer. I grabbed the radio. "Felix, are you awake?" He came back in seconds. "I'm awake, I have eyes on it. I've been watching for about 8 minutes. It's at your tower, Caleb." "I know. I'm on the spotting scope. It crossed the Taylor's Field, but I had the directional microphone running and it didn't register anything. No sound, no ground disturbance." I looked back down through the floor panel. Then the light went out, completely instantaneously, not fading this time, off, the way a lamp goes when the power fails. The darkness below the tower was absolute. I stood very still with the radio in my hand. That was when I heard the stairs. The Ridgeline Station Tower has an exterior steel staircase, open-sided, that climbs from the ground to the catwalk in 4 switchback flights. It was built in the late 1940s, and the metal sings when temperatures drop and groans when weight is applied to it. I knew those sounds the way you learn the sounds of a house you've lived in for years. Each landing, each riser, the particular note of the top flight, when the wind hit it from the north. Something was climbing the stairs, methodically. 1 step, a pause, another step, another pause. The rhythm of something that was not in a hurry. something that had no particular reason to rush. "Felix," I said quietly. "I hear it through the microphone," he said. His voice was even. "I don't see anything on the stairs. I don't see anything at all on visual." "But you hear it?" "Yes." I moved to the interior trapdoor, the hatch in the cabin floor that opens to the catwalk. I had left it unlatched, the way I always did in good weather. I latched it, a simple barrel bolt, the kind you'd find on a garden shed. I was aware, sliding it home, that it would not stop very much. The footsteps continued, slow, patient. Without intending to, I began counting. There are 47 steps from the ground to the catwalk level. I counted to 31 before my hands started shaking enough that I had to focus on keeping the radio still. "Caleb," Felix's voice was careful. "Stay on the line." "I'm here." The sound reached the upper landing, the last short flight before the catwalk, and stopped. Silence. I stood looking at the trapdoor, long enough that my legs began to ache, long enough that I went through every rational explanation I could construct. An animal that had somehow learned to use the stairs, a loose cable striking the structure in a rhythmic pattern, an acoustical effect generated by the unusual stillness, and dismissed each one and cycled through them again. Then something touched the trapdoor from below, not striking it, not forcing it. A slow, steady pressure, as if something were simply resting its weight against the hatch. The bolt held, and through the 2-inch gap between the door frame and the hatch panel a hand appeared. I want to describe what I saw as precisely as I can, because I have replayed it many times and I want the account to be accurate rather than sensational. It was a hand. That's the most honest thing I can say about it, but the proportions were wrong in a way that took a moment to register. The fingers were too long and not grotesquely, not like something from a film, but just enough that your eye caught it, and some part of your brain said, "No, that's not right." The skin was the pale color of old bone under fluorescent light. The nails were clean, trimmed short. The hand rested against the door frame the way a person rests an elbow in a window, casually or without urgency. It did not push, it did not grab, it simply rested there. "Felix," I said. "I see it," he said very quietly. "Through the scope. Caleb, I have it on camera." Neither of us said anything for a while. Then the hand withdrew slowly, without any apparent hurry, back through the gap and down. I listened. After what I deliberately counted as 60 full seconds, the stairs began again, going down this time the same measured pace. I tracked the sound all the way to what I judged to be the last step, and then there was nothing. I sat down on the floor with my back against the south wall and did not sleep again until the sky went grey. Donna arrived by ATV at 8:15 the next morning with a wildlife biologist named Stuart Kramer from the district office. Felix had radioed them before dawn. They spent 2 hours examining the base of the tower and the Talus Field approach. It had rained lightly between midnight and 3 a.m., a thin, consistent drizzle that would have left compression marks in the soft soil at the forest edge and at the foot of the stairs. There were none. Stuart photographed the mud beneath the first riser and the surrounding ground. Nothing heavier than a raindrop had touched it. They checked the staircase for any animal sign, any debris that might have created the sounds. Nothing. Donna asked me to walk her through the full timeline. I did it in order, calmly, the way I'd been trained to file emergency reports, events times my own actions, Felix's concurrent observations. When I reached the part about the hand, she didn't say anything. She just wrote something in her notebook. "Felix has footage," I told her. "I've seen it," she said. "What does it show?" She capped her pen. "The resolution at that range, at night, with that scope. You can see something at the level of the hatch. Whether it's an appendage or a shadow artifact or a lens reflection." She stopped. "I don't know, Caleb. She offered me a rotation reassignment to a different district. I asked if she was giving Felix the same option. "I'm offering it," she said. "It's his call." I took the reassignment. I finished that season at a station near the Methau Valley. Uneventful, peaceful in all the ordinary ways. Felix declined and stayed at Lone Ridge. When I tried to bring up what had happened during preseason briefings the following spring, he changed the subject with a finality that told me clearly he had decided how he was going to carry it. I respected that. Some things you process by talking them through, and some things you process by closing the door on them and not looking back. Neither way is wrong. Felix still works Lone Ridge Tower, 8 seasons now, I believe. I check his name on the district assignment roster sometimes just to make sure he's there. I've been stationed at a tower in the Bitterroot Range in Montana for the last 2 seasons. Lower elevation, broader sight lines, good visibility in all directions. Nothing has happened there that I can't explain, but I'll be honest with you about something because I think honesty is the only thing that gives a story like this any value. On nights when the wind drops completely and the forest below the cab goes quiet in that particular way, that way that's just slightly too complete, too even, like something pressing its palm flat against the sound, I catch myself checking the trapdoor bolt. Once, then again, then a third time, running my thumb along the metal until I can feel the resistance of the latch and know for certain it's engaged. And I leave the radio on all night. Not because I think it will protect me from anything, but because the sound of Felix breathing on the other end of the static, on the nights when I know he's awake up there at Lone Ridge watching his tree line, is about the closest thing I have to confirmation that what happened was real, that we both lived through it, and that whatever climbed those stairs that August night decided, for its own reasons, that it was not yet time for either of us. I don't ask for more certainty than that. In my experience, that kind of certainty is rarely on offer. We continue. There's a line I heard once from an old railroad man I met at a truck stop in rural Nevada. He was about 70, weathered like dry leather, and he said it completely unprompted while staring into his coffee. Some buildings are just hungry. At the time I laughed, because what else do you do when a stranger says something like that? I assumed he was the kind of man who had spent too many years alone on the road and had let the silence fill his head with superstition. I gave him a polite nod, paid my bill, and drove on. That was about 4 years before I started working nights at the Callaway Regional Dispatch Center in Eastern Oregon. And I want to make it very clear because people always ask, I am not someone who believes in things easily. I was in the Army for 6 years. I've seen real ugliness, the kind that has nothing supernatural about it whatsoever. And that kind of exposure tends to scrub away most irrational fears. You develop a very practical relationship with danger. You stop flinching at shadows, or at least you think you do. My name is Curtis Whelan. I'm 34 years old. I want to explain what happened at that building as clearly and honestly as I can because I've told this story twice in private. Once to my sister and once to a counselor the VA assigned me, and both times I felt like I wasn't believed, or worse, like I was being gently managed. Like they were humoring me. So this format, talking to strangers who actually want to hear it, feels like the right place. I took the dispatch job about 2.5 years ago. For those who don't know what that means, dispatch coordination for a regional logistics company means you're essentially the nervous system of a trucking and delivery network at night. Drivers call in, you track cargo, you reroute when there are road issues, you communicate with depots, you handle the administrative side of things that the daytime staff hands off. It's not glamorous, but it paid well, significantly better than anything else I'd found since leaving the service, and the isolation suited me. I've always worked better at night. Something about the quiet. The Callaway building itself had been retrofitted for corporate use sometime in the early 90s, from what I could tell, but the bones of the structure were much older. The company's main administrative offices occupied the second and third floors. Dispatch ran out of the first floor in what had clearly once been some kind of waiting room or reception area, high ceilings, original crown molding that had been painted over about 15 times, and windows that looked out onto a parking lot that nobody used after 6 p.m. I was replacing a man named Gerald, which I only found out on my second week when one of the daytime supervisors mentioned it casually. She said Gerald had moved on, which I initially read as a polite way of saying he'd quit. It wasn't until much later that I understood she'd chosen that phrase very deliberately, and for reasons that had nothing to do with employment. The only other person I shared those night shifts with was a woman named Phyllis Okafor. She was in her mid-50s, heavy-set, with reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain around her neck, and she had been working nights at Callaway for 11 years. 11! I thought that was remarkable. Most people I'd known in similar roles treated the work as temporary, and I said so. Her response was something I've thought about many times since. She smiled at me, not unkindly, and said, "The building doesn't let go of the ones it decides to keep." I chuckled. She didn't. For the first 2 months, nothing unusual happened. I want to be transparent about that because I know how these stories tend to go, and I don't want to retroactively manufacture signs that weren't there. The work was monotonous in the way all-night work is monotonous, long stretches of quiet interrupted by radio check-ins and the occasional rerouting call. The building made sounds the way old buildings do, pipes settling, the HVAC cycling on and off, wind coming in through the windows in the east corridor where the seal had deteriorated. Phyllis was pleasant company. She made tea around 2 a.m. every single night without fail, and always offered me a cup, which I always accepted. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it was substantive. She'd lived in that part of Oregon her whole life. She knew the history of the area in the way people who've stayed in one place always do. Layered, specific, occasionally unsettling. The first thing that shifted was small, so small I almost dismissed it. Around the 9th week, I started hearing, very faintly, what sounded like a phone ringing somewhere deeper in the building. Not our dispatch phones, which I knew by sound. Something older. A rotary-style ring, 2 short bursts, then silence. I assumed it was a residual sound somewhere, old wiring, a disconnected line that hadn't been fully decommissioned. I mentioned it to Phyllis on the 3rd night it happened. She didn't look up from her screen and she said, "Don't answer it." I told her there was nothing to answer. The sound was coming from somewhere in the building, not from our phones. She looked at me then, over her reading glasses, and repeated herself, "Don't answer it." And then she went back to her screen like she hadn't said anything unusual. I want to pause here and say something because this is the part where, in retrospect, most people would have started asking serious questions. I didn't, and I've had to sit with that. Part of it was the job. I genuinely needed the income. I was sending money back to my mother in Boise, who'd had a bad fall and was in assisted living, and part of it was the fact that Phyllis carried herself with such authority that challenging her felt like the wrong instinct. She wasn't threatening, she was simply certain. Uncertainty in the right person can read as safety, so I let it go. And for a while the ringing stopped. Then, around the 3rd month, something changed about the building at night. I can't describe it any more precisely than that, except to say that it felt less empty. Not crowded, not obviously inhabited, but less empty. Like the difference between a house where nobody lives and a house where someone used to live. There's a residue in the latter that you can feel even when you can't name it. I started noticing things out of the corner of my eye. Movement in the corridor beyond the dispatch room door. A shape at the far end of the parking lot that, when I looked directly at it, resolved into nothing, a light post, a dumpster, an arrangement of shadows. I told myself I was tired. I told myself the brain does this after long enough without adequate sleep, manufactures patterns in randomness to keep itself engaged. One night, I was roughly 12 weeks in. At this point, I asked Phyllis about Gerald. I wasn't sure why I chose that night exactly. She'd been quieter than usual, and there was something about the silence between us that felt like it was about to break open on its own, so I figured I'd rather direct it than be surprised by it. She was quiet for a long time after I asked. Then she said, "Gerald started going into the lower level." I didn't know there was a lower level. The building's layout, as I understood it, was 2 occupied upper floors and then our ground floor workspace. I'd seen a door near the east end of our corridor, heavy, institutional grey with a push-bar handle, but I'd assumed it was a utility room or a stairwell to HVAC equipment, and I'd never had any reason to try it. Phyllis confirmed it was a stairwell. She said the lower level had originally been a records archive from the building's previous occupant. She didn't tell me what that occupant was, and I noticed that I clocked the omission clearly and that it had been decommissioned when Calloway took over. She said there was nothing down there, and then she said something that in the weeks that followed I couldn't stop turning over. There's nothing down there that's supposed to be there. That's not the same thing as nothing being down there. She asked me not to go into the lower level. She asked me in a way that was serious but not dramatic, the same way you'd ask a friend not to drive on an icy road at night. Reasonable concern. I agreed without much hesitation, partly because there was genuinely no professional reason for me to go there, and partly because the conversation had left me with a cold, greasy feeling that I didn't want to examine too closely. After that night, Phyllis began doing something she hadn't done before. She started watching me, not aggressively, not in a way I could easily object to, but I would glance up from my screen and find her eyes on me. I would come back from the bathroom and notice her posture shift, like she'd been oriented toward the corridor I'd walked back through, and had only just turned away. It wasn't threatening, but it was deliberate, and after 2 weeks of it, the cumulative weight of her attention had started to press. I brought it up once. I said, and I tried to be casual, "Phyllis, is everything all right? You've been watching me." She thought about it for a moment in that measured way she did everything. Then she said, "I'm watching to see which way it goes with you." I asked what that meant. She said, "The building picks eventually. I'm watching to see if it's going to pick you." I didn't sleep well that day. The night the lower level door was open, I almost walked right past it. It was about 3:15 a.m. Phyllis had gone to use the restroom. I was doing a walk of the ground floor, something I did 2 or 3 times a night, more out of habit than protocol, and as I passed the east corridor, I noticed the grey door was ajar by about 8 inches. Not fully open, just open enough to show a slice of darkness beyond it, and the top of a concrete staircase going down. I stood there for what felt like a long time. I knew what Phyllis had said. I had no professional obligation to investigate. I had every reasonable motive to close the door, note it in the log, and move on. But there was light coming from below. Not much. A faint, sallow glow that shouldn't have existed in a decommissioned archive with no active power connections. And there was sound. Not the ringing I'd heard before, something slower, something that took me almost a full minute to identify as standing in that corridor at 3 a.m. because my brain resisted categorizing it correctly. It was breathing, coordinated, multiple sources, a low, slow, rhythmic exhale that rose and fell in something close to unison, not quite synchronized, which somehow made it worse than if it had been exact. I pushed the door fully open. I can't explain why. Call it military instinct, call it stupid curiosity, call it whatever you want. I've called it every name I can think of, and none of them satisfactorily explain why my hand went to that door and pushed. But I pushed it, and I went to the top of the staircase, and I looked down. The lower level was a long, low room. Concrete floors, exposed pipe running along the ceiling, shelving units along the walls that still held deteriorating cardboard boxes. Industrial, abandoned. The light source was something I couldn't immediately locate. A diffuse, sourceless illumination that seemed to come from the air itself rather than any fixture. There were figures at the far end of the room. I counted 3, though I'm not certain of the number even now. They were standing very still facing the back wall, and they were tall, too tall, the way you notice when a person's proportions are slightly off and your brain registers the wrongness before you can articulate it. They were dressed in what looked like office clothing. Business casual, one of them had a lanyard around their neck. I'm aware of how this sounds. I want to be precise about what I experienced versus what I interpreted because I think conflating those two things is how these accounts lose credibility. What I experienced was 3 tall figures motionless facing a wall. What I interpreted was wrongness, fundamental structural wrongness, the kind you feel in your teeth before you feel it anywhere else. One of them turned around. I didn't wait to see its face. I want to be honest about that. I didn't stand there and look at it. I was moving before I had made any conscious decision to move, back up the stairs and through the grey door, pulling it closed behind me. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had trouble with the push bar, which isn't designed to be operated from the other side. And I had a terrible, sickening few seconds where I thought I'd have to leave it open and just run. I got it closed. I walked back to the dispatch room. I sat down. I put my headset on, though no calls were queued. Phyllis returned from the restroom about 3 minutes later, and she looked at me immediately, not the way you look at someone you happen to notice, but the way you look at someone whose face you've been bracing yourself to read. She said, "You went down." Not a question. I told her what I'd seen, all of it, in the order I'd seen it. She listened without interrupting, which is its own kind of unnerving when the content is what it was. When I finished, she removed her reading glasses and set them on the desk, and was quiet for almost a minute. Then she told me about the building. She told me the lower level had been used in the 1970s as an adjunct processing area for a facility whose name she mentioned only once and quietly, because even she seemed reluctant to say it aloud. It was a state-contracted institution, a long-term care facility for individuals deemed too difficult for standard placement. She said the word difficult with a very particular flatness that communicated clearly that it was not her word, that it was the word the institution had used, and that it carried decades of weight she wasn't prepared to unpack in a dispatch room at 3 a.m. She said that people had come into that lower level and had not come back out in any meaningful sense. She said this carefully, in language that was precise and not dramatic. She said that whatever remained there, she didn't call them ghosts. She never used that word. Whatever remained there had developed over time. A pattern of engagement with the people who worked in the building at night, that they were drawn to attentiveness, to stillness, to people who were already awake when the rest of the world was asleep, people whose particular alertness resonated with something that had learned to look for it. She said Gerald had gone down 3 times before the 4th time. After the 4th time, he'd stopped speaking coherently. He'd been found sitting in the parking lot at 6 a.m. by the daytime facilities manager. He was not hurt, he was not physically harmed in any way. But something in him had shifted into a register that normal conversation couldn't reach anymore, and as far as Phyllis knew, he hadn't come back from it. I asked her how she'd stayed for 11 years. She said she'd learned a long time ago not to engage, that the key was indifference, and not performed indifference, not forced calm, but a genuine and practiced disengagement from what the building offered. She said it like it was a skill she'd developed the way you develop any skill, through repetition and discipline, and that most people didn't have the particular temperament for it. She looked at me then with an expression that was the closest thing to pity I'd seen on her face. "You went in the first time they left the door open," she said. "That means it's already chosen you." I asked her what that meant in practical terms. She said, "It means you'll hear it more clearly now. It means the door will be open again." I went home that morning and sat in my kitchen with the lights on until noon. I called my sister, tried to explain it, and heard my own story contract under the pressure of daylight and her reasonable questions until it sounded like nothing like the dreams of an overtired man who'd been working nights too long. I told her I was fine. She believed me because it was easier too. I went back the next night, and the night after that, because I needed the job, because my mother's assisted living fees don't pause for existential crises, because I am, despite everything, a practical person. But I won't pretend the second month was anything like the first. The ringing phone came back, always at different times, always stopping before I could trace it. The feeling of being watched, and I don't mean by Phyllis now, the feeling of being watched from the corridor became a permanent atmospheric feature, like the smell of the place or the color of the light. Something had recalibrated its attention toward me, and I could feel the weight of it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. I have not gone back down to the lower level. I've made that choice every single night, consciously, deliberately. The grey door has been opened 3 more times since the first. I've closed it every time without looking at what's at the top of the stairs. But I hear them now. That's the part I've been reluctant to say, because it sounds the most unstable. And I've spent a lot of effort since all this started trying to sound stable. I hear them in the ambient sound of the building, not voices exactly, not words I can pass, but a presence in the sound. A quality to the silence that didn't exist in the first 2 months, that I know is not my imagination. Phyllis says the best she can offer me is the same thing she's built for herself over 11 years. Technique and discipline. She says some people manage it. She hasn't told me what happens to the ones who don't. I think about Gerald. I think about what moved on means when the person saying it has been in that building long enough to know exactly what she's saying. I am still working nights at the Callaway building in Eastern Oregon. I haven't told anyone who could do anything about it because I don't know who that would be or what they'd do. And Phyllis has made it quietly clear that drawing outside attention to the building has historically produced outcomes that were not improvements on the baseline situation. That old railroad man in Nevada, the one who said some buildings are hungry, I've thought about him a lot these past few months. I don't think he was a superstitious man. I think he was a practical man who had seen something specific, and the most accurate language available to him was a metaphor. He was right. He just wasn't specific enough. It isn't hunger exactly. It's something more patient than hunger. Hunger implies desperation. What's in that lower level, whatever got left behind in those concrete rooms, whatever learned to wait in the dark while the state facility processed its difficult people and then closed its doors and handed the building off to a logistics company that doesn't know what's in its own basement, that's not desperate. It has all the time in the world. It already proved that. And now it knows my name. We continue. The last shipment I hauled before everything changed was a standard refrigerated load medical equipment headed from Portland down to a distribution center in Redding, California, 14 hours on the road. I'd done that route so many times I could navigate it half asleep, which, looking back now, might have been the whole problem. My name is Dale Whitfield, and I've been driving 18-wheelers for going on 19 years. People who haven't done this job tend to romanticize it. The open road, the freedom, the solitude, and yeah, some days it really is like that. But there's another side to it that nobody talks about. The grinding loneliness, the way time bends and warps when you've been behind the wheel for 12 hours, the strange thoughts that crawl into your head when it's 3 a.m., and the only thing between you and a ditch is a yellow center line and whatever caffeine you ingested 3 exits ago. I've driven through ice storms in Montana. I've navigated flooded roads in Louisiana. I've had blowouts on mountain passes with no shoulder and a 1,000-foot drop to my right. None of that ever scared me the way that night on the 97 scared me. It was a Tuesday in late October. I remember because my daughter had just turned 8 the weekend before, and I'd had to miss her birthday party not for the first time. My wife Connie had sent me a video of the kids around the cake, and I'd watched it twice on my phone in a truck stop parking lot in Sacramento before I got back in the cab and kept moving. That's the job. You learn to carry the guilt the same way you learn to carry everything else quietly and without stopping. I was making good time. The highway was clear, the load was secure, and I'd already checked in with dispatch twice. By my estimate, I'd be in Redding by 2 a.m., get a few hours in the sleeper, deliver by 8, and be home for lunch the next day. Then I stopped at a rest area south of Klamath Falls. I didn't need fuel. I just needed to stretch my legs and use the restroom 10 minutes, maybe 15. Standard stop. The rest area was one of those older ones with a covered picnic structure, a couple of vending machines, and a single restroom building. The kind of place that feels slightly abandoned even at noon. At 11 at night, it felt like the end of the world. There was one other vehicle there when I pulled in, a beat-up camper van, probably from the 80s, parked off to the side with its interior lights on. I didn't think much of it. You see all kinds on long hauls. When I came out of the restroom, there was a man standing next to my rig, not leaning against it, not pacing around it, just standing, facing it with his back to me. He was older. I could tell that much, the way he held himself, slightly hunched, with that particular stillness that comes with age. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, and he had a wool cap on his head, despite the fact that it wasn't especially cold that night. I slowed down. My hand went to my phone out of instinct. I've picked up my share of hitchhikers over the years, though the company strictly forbids it. Most of them are just people in bad situations, broke, stranded, dealing with something they'd rather not explain. You develop a sense for who's harmless and who isn't. This man from behind didn't read as dangerous, he read as lost. "Can I help you?" I called out. He turned around slowly. He had a wide, weathered face, deeply lined, with eyes that were pale gray and very steady. Not the shifty, nervous eyes of someone who's up to no good. More like the eyes of someone who's been through a great deal and stopped being surprised by most of it. "Sorry to bother you," he said. His voice was low and even. "I saw your Oregon plates. I'm trying to get up to Chemolt. My van threw a belt about 2 miles back. I coasted in here." Chemolt. That was maybe 40 miles north, back the way I'd come. "I'm heading south," I told him. He nodded like he'd expected that. I figured, it's all right. He glanced back at the camper van. "I've got a phone. I'll get someone out eventually." There was something about the way he said it, not self-pitying, not angling for sympathy, just factual. "I've got a phone. I'll manage." The quiet dignity of a man who wasn't going to beg. I thought about my daughter's birthday video. I thought about all the times someone had done me a kindness on the road without having to. I thought about a lot of things in the span of about 4 seconds. "I can take you back up to Chemolt," I said. "I've got time." That wasn't exactly true. It would add at least an hour and a half to my drive. But I said it anyway. His name was Gerald Rowe, and he'd been a commercial fisherman out of Storie for most of his adult life. Crab boats, primarily, working the Pacific off the Oregon coast. He'd retired a few years back after a back injury that had left him with a permanent limp, and now he traveled around in that camper van visiting old friends, fishing lakes, doing the slow lap of a life he'd deferred for 30 years while out on the water. He talked the way men of that generation often do, plainly, without embellishment, but with a precision that told you every word was considered. He told me about the crabbing industry, about the way the boats worked, about the particular quality of pre-dawn light on the Pacific when the swells were running at 6 to 8 feet. He talked about his son who lived in Bend and who he was going to see. He never asked me anything about myself, which I appreciated. Some passengers feel obligated to turn the cab into a talk show. Gerald just talked when he had something to say and went quiet when he didn't, and the quiet was comfortable. We were about 15 miles north of the rest area when he said something that changed the energy in the cab. "You know this stretch of road? The 97? I've run it 100 times. You know what's down there? He gestured east toward the darkness beyond the tree line. Off the highway back into the timber? Ranches, I'd guess. Wilderness. There's a reservoir, Gerald said. Private land, but I know the family that owns it. I fished it a couple times. Beautiful lake, cold even in August. He paused. There's something wrong with that water. I glanced at him. He wasn't being dramatic about it. He said it the same way he'd described crab season quotas as a fact he was simply conveying. What do you mean wrong? I don't know how to explain it better than that. He was looking out the passenger window at the dark tree line. First time I fished it, nothing happened. Beautiful day, caught 3 decent browns, drove home. Second time, this was in the spring 2 years ago. I was out in a little aluminum boat just after sunrise. The water was like glass, and then something came up from underneath. He stopped. What came up? I asked. I don't know what it was. I saw it before I saw it, if that makes any sense to you. There was a shadow moving under the water, but the shape was wrong for a fish. Wrong for anything I'd ever seen. And I've been on the water my whole life. I know what fish look like underwater. This wasn't a fish. He turned to look at me. It was big, and it moved like it was aware of me, like it was watching me from underneath. I didn't say anything. The highway ran arrow straight in my headlights. I got off that lake as fast as I could row, Gerald continued. I didn't look back. I loaded the boat and left, and I didn't tell the family what I'd seen because I didn't know what I'd tell them. He folded his hands in his lap. The third time I went, I didn't even put the boat in. I just stood at the bank and looked at the water for a while. And I'll tell you something. The way that water looked that day, the color of it, the way it was moving, there was nothing alive in it. No insects, no birds along the bank, and no frog noise. Just silence. The kind of silence you feel in your chest. He went quiet after that. I told myself the story was just old man folklore, the kind of thing that grows in isolated places the way moss grows on rock. I'd heard dozens of stories like it over the years. Every region had its version, something in the water, something in the woods, something on the road that shouldn't be there. I dropped Gerald in Chemult at the one intersection that qualified as a town center. He shook my hand and thanked me. He reached into his jacket pocket and held something out to me. It was a lure, a fishing lure, handmade it looked like, carved from wood and painted in a pattern of dark green and silver. The hook had been removed. I made that one myself, he said. You don't need the hook for what I'm giving it to you for. He pressed it into my palm. If you're ever on a piece of water and you feel like something's not right, like the place is too quiet, like things have stopped moving around you, you take that out of your pocket and you set it on the surface of the water. Don't throw it in, just set it down and step back. What does that do? I asked. He gave me a small, quiet smile. It gives whatever's down there something to look at other than you. Then he turned and walked toward a payphone. There was still a payphone on that corner, which struck me as remarkable, and I got back in my truck and headed south again. I was running about an hour and 40 minutes behind when I crossed back through Klamath Falls. I made up some time on the long straight south of town, and by 3 a.m. I was in good spirits despite the delay. The detour had cost me my cushion, but I'd still make the delivery window if I kept my pace. Then the road curved along the river. There's a stretch of the 97 in Northern California where the highway follows a river through a canyon for about 12 miles. It's a beautiful drive in daylight, black basalt walls, the river silver green in the sun. At 3 a.m. in late October, it's a very different experience. The canyon walls block out the sky, and the road surface darkens in the reflected shadow, and it feels somehow narrower than it actually is. I was about 4 miles into the canyon when I saw the figure on the side of the road. A woman, standing on the narrow gravel shoulder, facing the road, waving one arm. I slowed down immediately. You have to, in those situations, you can't pass a person standing on a highway in a canyon at 3 in the morning without at least slowing to assess. I rolled up with my hazards on and got a better look. She looked to be in her 30s, dark hair, wearing a light jacket that was not adequate for the temperature. She looked distressed but not injured. No visible blood, no damaged vehicle nearby. I cracked the window. You all right? I called out. My car went off the road, she said. Her voice was calm, eerily calm, I thought, for someone who'd just driven off a highway. About a quarter mile back, into the river. Into the river? It went through the guardrail. She pointed back into the darkness. I got out, but the car's gone. I scanned the area. No guardrail breach that I could see from where I sat. No debris on the road. But the shoulder behind her was in the shadow of the canyon wall, and I couldn't see far. I'll call 911, I said. I was already reaching for my phone. There's no signal in the canyon, she said. I tried. That's why I've been waiting. That was probably true. Canyons were notorious dead zones. I looked at my own phone, one bar flickering. You can ride with me to the other end of the canyon, I said. 5 minutes. We'll get you to where there's signal and get emergency services out here. She looked at me for a moment, and the look was strange. It wasn't the look of someone relieved to be helped. It was more evaluative than that, more patient, like she was considering options. That's kind of you, she said, and reached for the door handle. I should have let her in. Any reasonable account of the situation said I should let her in, but something stopped me, a feeling I couldn't name, a particular quality of wrongness, not anything I could point to, just the silence around her, the way the river sounded louder than it should have, close and insistent, the fact that she wasn't shivering despite the temperature. And then I remembered what Gerald Rowe had said, the kind of silence you feel in your chest. My hand moved on its own, almost. I reached into my jacket pocket where I'd put the wooden lure he'd given me, and I pulled it out and set it on the edge of the open window. Just set it on the surface, don't throw it in, just set it down and step back. The reaction was immediate, and it was not anything I had prepared myself for. The woman's eyes went to the lure, and they stayed there. The calm on her face cracked, and underneath it was something I don't have a word for, not rage, not hunger, not confusion, though it had elements of all three. Her hand on the door handle went still. She stared at that piece of carved wood for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably 15 seconds. Then she stepped back from the truck. Just one step, but the quality of the step was wrong in a way that I will not be able to adequately describe no matter how many times I try. Her foot went back up, but the rest of her didn't follow with the natural sequencing of human movement. It was like watching a recording skipped backward. I hit the gas. I am not proud of it. If she had been a woman who'd really driven her car into that river, I left her on a canyon road at 3 a.m. I've made peace with that over time by telling myself that if she'd been real, she'd have been found, because I called 911 the moment I cleared the canyon and had signal, and I described the location, and the dispatcher told me they'd send someone out. There was no accident. The sheriff's report, which I eventually obtained through a public records request because I couldn't let it go, noted that deputies had checked the entire 12-mile stretch of highway and found no evidence of a vehicle leaving the road. No breach in the guardrail. No vehicle in the river. No missing person report matching the description of the woman I'd seen. Nothing. I've thought about that night a great many times in the years since. I've thought about what it would mean if Gerald Rowe had simply been a lonely old man telling road stories, and the lure was just a piece of painted wood, and the woman in the canyon was a real person in real distress whom I abandoned on a dark highway because of a superstition a stranger had handed me in the cab of a truck. But the sheriff's report keeps pulling me back, and the way she looked at that lure, I still carry it. It lives in the inside pocket of the jacket I wear on long hauls, the same spot where my daughter's school photo lives, which I know sounds like I'm trying to make it mean something neat and resolved. I'm not. Some things don't resolve. You just learn to carry them the same way you carry everything else. The lure and the photo and the guilt and the miles. You drive on. We continue. Most people, when they think about what lives inside the walls of their home, imagine something small. A mouse, maybe. A family of raccoons making a mess of the attic insulation. Maybe a colony of bats that has claimed the upper eaves for the season. Something with 4 legs and fur. Something that scurries and scratches and announces itself in the quiet hours of the night, leaving behind the faint evidence of its presence, droppings along the baseboards, tiny teeth marks in the foam around a pipe. That particular musty smell that means something has been living somewhere it shouldn't. That's the normal version of the story. In 11 years of wildlife removal work, I've told the normal version 1,000 times. My name is Owen Marsh. I'm 38 years old, and I work out of Hartwell, North Carolina for a company called Ridge Wildlife Solutions, a 2-man operation my former boss started 20 years ago, and which I more or less run now that he's mostly retired. We handle the calls that homeowners can't handle themselves. The raccoon that figured out how to pry apart a soffit vent, the possum that died inside a kitchen wall and didn't make itself known until 2 weeks later in July, The groundhog that tunneled under a back porch and took half the foundation support with it. It is not glamorous work. My wife Dana used to still jokes, that she could tell what kind of job I'd had that day before I even got through the front door. Skunk was the worst, she said, though I disagreed, and I still disagree. I'll take skunk over the smell of an animal that's been decomposing in a wall cavity for 2 weeks in summer heat. There is nothing in the world quite like that particular smell, and the fact that you have to go toward it, that you have to find it and get close to it and eventually remove what's left, is the kind of thing that doesn't make it into the job listing. But it's honest work, and after 11 years it's mine in the way that only a thing you've done 1,000 times can ever truly be yours. I know every sound that a living animal makes inside a wall. I know the difference between the quick high-frequency scratching of a squirrel and the slower, heavier movement of a raccoon. I know what a bat colony sounds like at dusk, a dry, papery rustling, like someone rapidly leafing through an enormous book. I know the sound of something newly arrived and the sound of something dying, and I have learned to distinguish between all the countless variations in between. There is a sound for almost everything that lives. That was what I believed before the evening of October 14th. I had 3 calls that day, and the first 2 were routine. A squirrel entry point sealed at a house on the north side of town in the morning. A dead raccoon removed from under a deck out past Kimball Road in the afternoon. By 4:30, I was already mentally at home, thinking about my daughter Lily's school play that evening. She had 12 lines as some kind of moon attendant in her class production, and she had been practicing those 12 lines at the dinner table for 3 weeks when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The caller was a woman named Claire Hoffman. She spoke quickly, in the way of someone who expects to be told no. She explained that she'd recently inherited a property from her great-uncle, a farmhouse 12 miles east of Hartwell, out past the county line on Route 9. She needed someone to assess the building before a renovation contractor came in. The house had been sitting empty for nearly 3 years. She'd already contacted 3 other companies over the past 2 weeks, she said, and none of them had been able to take the job. I asked her why. There was a brief pause. She said she wasn't entirely sure. One company had sent a man out to look at the exterior, and he'd called her back the same evening to decline without explaining his reasons. I almost said no. The drive would eat what remained of the afternoon, and I'd promised Dana I'd be home by 6. But then Claire mentioned the fee nearly double my standard inspection rate, and I had a truck payment due at the end of the month, and a water heater that had been making a sound for 6 weeks that I knew was going to cost me something significant. I told her I could be there by 5. I should have said no. I know that now. I pulled onto the dirt road off Route 9 just after 5:15. The late October afternoon was already going grey and thin at the edges, that particular kind of fading autumn light that feels hurried and apologetic. The oaks lining the drive had lost most of their leaves, and they stood bare against the pale sky in a way that made the road feel longer than it was. The farmhouse sat at the end of the drive in a clearing of dead grass. 2 stories, a covered wraparound porch, the original white paint weathered down to a chalky yellow-grey. It looked smaller than I'd expected from Claire's description, and older than the photograph she'd emailed me. There was a settled, sunken quality to the whole structure, the way a house looks when the ground beneath it has been pressing upward for a very long time and the building has simply stopped resisting. What I noticed most, even before I cut the engine, was the silence. I've worked rural properties for 11 years. I know what the country sounds like in October, squirrels working the leaf litter, birds making their last active passes through the fields before the cold fully arrives, the ambient texture of living things going about the urgent business of the season. This property had none of that. No birds, no movement in the tree line. The fields around the house were quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like evacuation, as if something had cleared the area of everything that breathed. I stood beside my truck for a moment before approaching, just listening. Nothing. Claire was on the porch steps. She was younger than her voice had suggested, late 20s, dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of disrupted sleep, arms folded over her jacket in a posture that might have been cold but read more like unease. She shook my hand and thanked me for coming out. She mentioned again that she'd had difficulty finding someone willing to make the drive. I asked when the house had last been occupied. About 3 years, she said. My uncle Tom lived here alone after my aunt Eleanor passed. He got sick toward the end and She paused, choosing words carefully. The hospice workers said he was difficult to communicate with in the last several months. He kept saying things that didn't make sense. What kind of things? I asked. She looked at the porch boards rather than at me. He kept saying he could hear Eleanor downstairs. He kept saying she was calling him to come and see something. His wife? She died of cancer in 2009. I noted that and let it sit where it was. I told her I'd start with the ground floor and work my way down. She said she'd wait outside. That suited me fine. Clients who follow me during an inspection slow everything down. The house smelled the way they all do when they've been closed up for years. That particular mixture of dust and settled damp and old air that every uninhabited building accumulates over time. I worked through the ground floor methodically, flashlight and headlamp both running, checking baseboards and corners and the spaces behind appliances. Living room, dining room, 2 bedrooms, the back hallway. Mouse droppings near the kitchen, baseboards old and dry, nothing active. The usual evidence of seasonal visitors making use of a vacant space. The smell was there all along, just underneath everything else. A faint sweetness, too warm for an October house with no heat running, too organic and alive for a room that hadn't held a person in 3 years. I kept registering it and setting it aside. I found the cellar door in the hallway between the kitchen and the back bedroom. An old wooden door painted over several times in successive decades. I opened it and stood at the top of the stairs with my flashlight aimed down. That was when the smell changed. It didn't grow stronger exactly, it grew more present, as if the opening of the door had released something that had been waiting behind it. Heavy and sweet and unmistakably wrong, like fruit that has fermented past the point of ripeness, past the point where sweetness begins to become something else entirely. It was the kind of smell that your body responds to before your mind catches up with the reasoning. I stood at the top of the stairs and listened. The sound was low enough that I might have dismissed it as pipe noise or the house settling in the cooling evening. A slow, deep rhythm. Almost but not quite regular. Like breathing filtered through several feet of earth and concrete, patient and very old and not particularly concerned about being heard. I told myself it was the plumbing. I went down. The cellar was low-ceilinged and bone-dry, which caught my attention immediately. Most cellars this age, in clay-heavy soil, hold standing water every spring. This floor was dry as powder. A few shelves along the near wall held mason jars filmed with so much dust that the contents had become unidentifiable. A rusted oil tank occupied the corner to my right. Beyond it, concrete block walls rose to meet the floor joists above. Everything looked ordinary until I reached the far corner behind the oil tank. The back wall of the cellar was fieldstone original 1890s foundation, the mortar crumbling in places where the stone had shifted over a century of settling, and set into the center of that wall, at roughly knee height, was an opening. The mortar had given way around 4 or 5 stones, and the stones themselves had been removed, leaving a gap roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, a dark passage leading into whatever lay beyond the foundation. I've found gaps like this before. Old farmhouses sometimes have root cellars within root cellars, forgotten spaces from a different era of construction. I crouched down and pointed my flashlight through the opening. What I saw made me pull back before I'd fully processed it. Inside the gap, in the narrow space between the stone foundation and the packed earth beyond, something had been arranged, deliberately and carefully arranged, the way a person arranges objects they intend to return to. A semicircle of small bones laid out on the dirt floor, sorted by size with a precision that excluded all possibility of accident. Bird bones, most of them, though I couldn't have said with certainty which species. Between the bones, pressed into the soil at even intervals, a child's shoe, old brown leather cracked along the seams. A woman's wristwatch, the crystal face cracked, the hand stopped at 11:47. A set of keys on a rusted ring, old-fashioned keys, the kind that fit locks no longer manufactured. A small glass bottle, empty, a dark residue dried into its base. At the center of the semicircle, a shallow depression in the earth, the size of a large dinner plate, the soil pressed down by repeated weight and pressure, compressed in the way soil only compresses when something returns to the same spot over and over a very long time. I stayed crouching there for what I estimate was 30 seconds. My flashlight was steady. In 11 years I have trained myself to observe before I react, because panic in a confined space is dangerous. I was observing, I was noting each object, I was constructing rational explanations and finding that none of them held. Then I heard the voice. It came from the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach, from further back in the earth, past the depth my beam could find. A small voice, high and clear and entirely distinct. A child's voice. It said my daughter's name, all three parts, Lillian Marsh. Not the ghost of a sound, not something that could be acoustics or plumbing or my tired mind at the end of a long day. Clear and specific and addressed to me, and it knew the name of my child. I do not remember climbing the stairs. I remember crouching in front of that opening, and then I remember standing in the upstairs hallway with my hand on the cellar door frame, and I have no reliable account of what happened in between. I walked through the front door and out onto the porch, and Claire looked at my face and stepped to the side without saying anything. The way you step aside for someone who is moving with a purpose they haven't fully explained yet. I told her to get off the property and not to come back. I told her to sell it for land value, tear the house down, let the trees come back over the clearing. I told her not to let anyone else go into the cellar under any circumstances. She started to ask why, and I said I was sorry, that I couldn't help her, and I walked to my truck. That was when Gerald Pruitt came around the side of the house from the direction of the tree line. He was a man in his late 70s, broad-shouldered despite his age, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has walked the same land for 50 years. Canvas jacket the color of dried tobacco, boots with serious mud on them. He looked at me with pale, steady eyes that had already made their own assessment. "You went into the cellar," he said, not a question. His name was Gerald Pruitt. He told me he'd farmed the adjacent land for 43 years, all his adult life, inherited from his father before him. He and the original owner of this house had been, in his words, not friendly, which was why he knew more about what happened here than he'd ever wanted to know. The house had been built in 1891 by a man named Caswell, he told me, a northerner who came down and bought the land cheap and lived there alone. He was known in the county as a man of unusual interest, to someone who ordered books from distant places and kept records that no one else was permitted to see. He was not a sociable man. He kept to himself in a way that local people over time began to interpret as something other than simple privacy. The disappearances started gradually. Livestock from neighboring farms, always in October, always during the same weeks of the season. Pets. 2 farmhands hired for a harvest season in 1923 who walked into the East Field one morning and were never found. No investigation led anywhere, no charges were filed. Caswell died in 1941, and the house passed through several families in the following decades, each one staying shorter than the last, each one leaving without fully explaining why. Tom Hoffman, Claire's uncle, knew all of this when he bought the place, Gerald said. He thought it was old county gossip. He thought whatever Caswell had let in had left when Caswell left. He was wrong, but he wasn't wrong right away. Tom lived there peacefully for 8 years. Gerald paused and looked at the house for a moment before going on. Then one night he called me at 2 in the morning, said he could hear Eleanor in the cellar, said she was calling to him, telling him to come down and see what she'd found. Eleanor had been dead for 14 years. Tom knew that. He was a clear-minded man, not given to confusion, not given to fanciful thinking. He called me because he needed someone else to know what was happening to him, and because he already understood that what he was hearing wasn't her. "Did he go down?" I asked. Gerald was quiet for long enough that I stopped expecting an answer. Then he said, "He lived alone in that house for 3 more years after that first call. I'll let you make of that what you will." It was full dark by then. I looked back at the house. The upstairs windows were black rectangles. The 2 small cellar windows, set just above ground level, showed a dim glow that had no business being there, nothing directional, nothing that resembled a flashlight or any electrical source, something diffuse and faintly pulsing, the color of deep water seen from above. The color of something that generates its own light because it has been in the dark for so long that it has simply learned to make do. "What is it?" I asked. "What's in there?" Gerald pulled his collar up against the evening cold. He looked at the house for a long moment before he answered. "It learns what you love," he said. "It finds the specific shape of the thing you'd go back for, then it makes itself into that shape and waits. I don't know what Caswell opened down there. I don't know what name you'd give it, if there is one. What I know is that it's been here longer than the house, Longer than cabs were, longer than anyone's record of this county. He just gave it a way to reach through. He told me to get in my truck, drive straight through to town, don't pull over for any reason, go home, hold my family close, and be genuinely grateful for them. Because gratitude was something the thing in the cellar could not replicate. It could replicate the voice and the name, but not the actual weight of what love costs. Go, he said, and don't come back to this road. I thanked him. I'm still not entirely sure for what. I drove back to Hartwell with the radio turned up loud enough that I couldn't hear my own thoughts, and I didn't look in the rearview mirror for the first 4 miles. The county road was dark and completely empty, and the bare trees on either side moved in a wind that had come up while I was on the property. I was 19 minutes late for Lily's play. Dana gave me a look when I slid into the seat beside her in the gymnasium, and I took her hand and held it and didn't let go. Lily was already on stage, serious in her paper crown, delivering her 12 lines with the total commitment of a 9-year-old who has memorized something and is not going to allow anything in the world to come between her and the successful delivery of it. I watched every second of it. I did not look at my phone once. She ran to me in the lobby afterward, and I held her longer than she wanted me to, long enough that she announced, with the frank and immediate assessment that only children can deliver, that I smelled like work. I know, I said. I'm sorry. It's okay, she said, and she was already moving, scanning the gymnasium for her grandparents. That night, after everyone was asleep, I sat in the kitchen for a long time and thought about Tom Hoffman, alone in that farmhouse, listening to his dead wife's voice rising through the floorboards at 2 a.m, knowing what it was and knowing it wasn't her and staying anyway. I thought about what Gerald had said, that he'd learned what you loved. I thought about how a loneliness deep enough might eventually blur that distinction, might make the false version acceptable, might make a person willing to descend those cellar stairs just to hear the right voice say the right name in the dark. I thought about that for a long time. I called Claire Hoffman the next morning and returned her deposit in full. I told her the property had issues beyond my area of expertise, and that she should consult a specialist, the kind I couldn't quite point her toward before anyone else entered. She accepted this with a quietness that told me she had already halfway expected a response like this. I don't know what she ultimately decided to do. I've driven Route 9 several times since then on the way to other jobs, and the dirt road is still there, still lined with those bare oaks. I have never once turned down it. I still do the same work I've always done: raccoons, squirrels, the occasional stubborn groundhog. I still spend my days in the crawl spaces of ordinary houses, listening for the sounds of ordinary animals leading ordinary lives inside other people's walls. I don't take calls on properties more than 8 miles outside of town anymore. I've told people it's a policy change, an insurance thing, and they accept that because it sounds reasonable and because no one wants the actual explanation. But here is the truest thing I know now, the thing I couldn't have said 2 years ago. I used to sleep without difficulty. Head on the pillow, out in 5 minutes, straight through until the alarm. 11 years of physical labor and a clean conscience, Dana always said. She envied it. Some nights now, in that specific dark moment when sleep is just arriving, I hear something, very faint. It seems to come from somewhere inside the wall beside our bed, from that space between the drywall and the exterior cladding, where the insulation runs and the pipes contract in the cold, and the house makes all its ordinary nighttime sounds. It is a small voice, high and clear and fractionally wrong, the way a familiar song sounds when someone who has only heard it once tries to hum it from memory and hasn't quite gotten the pitch right. It says my daughter's name, and every time it does, I get up. I walk down the hall in my bare feet and I stand in Lily's doorway, and I wait until I can hear her breathing. Slow and steady and absolutely completely real. So far, that has always been enough. I leave the hall light on. Every night now, without exception. Dana asked me once why I'd started doing that, and I told her it was just a habit I'd picked up, and she accepted that the way she accepts most things about me, with patience and without too much additional inquiry. There are 2 things I have quietly stopped doing since October 14th of last year. The first is taking calls on Route 9, and the second is going near the walls of my own house after dark. We continue. My name is Marcus. I spent 19 years in the United States Army, most of them as a combat engineer. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and more training deployments across Central America and the Pacific than I can count on both hands. I've slept in holes in the ground. I've eaten things that would make a dog turn away. I've seen men die in ways I won't describe here, not because I can't talk about it, but because some images deserve to stay buried. I'm telling you all this so you understand I'm not a man who frightens easily. I'm not a man who invents stories to get attention. Everything I'm about to tell you happened. I have lived with it for 23 years, and some nights it still finds me. This was in the late summer of 2001, just weeks before September 11th changed everything. My unit was stationed at Fort Bragg, but we'd been temporarily reassigned to assist with what they called a civil infrastructure assessment in a rural stretch of eastern Kentucky coal country, deep in the hills, places the rest of America forgets exist. The mission had nothing to do with combat. We were there to evaluate old infrastructure in a handful of small townships that were applying for federal assistance, water systems, roads, power lines, things like that. There were 4 of us. Myself, a staff sergeant named Carl Pruitt who was built like a refrigerator and had the personality of one, a younger specialist named Devin Oakes who was fresh out of engineering school and talked too much about video games, and our civilian liaison, a woman from the Army Corps of Engineers named Patricia. She was the one with the actual expertise on water systems. We called her Pat, though she never asked us to. Our assignment was to visit 7 communities over the course of 5 days and submit preliminary reports. Simple work. The kind of assignment that soldiers call a vacation, even if they complain about the boredom out loud. The first 4 communities went without incident. Small, quiet towns carved into the sides of mountains, where the people watched us from porches and didn't wave but didn't cause trouble either. Coal had left most of these places hollowed out. The young people had left. What remained were the old and the stubborn, people who had decided that these hills were theirs regardless of what the economy said about it. On the 4th day, we drove deeper into the hills to reach the 5th community on our list, a place called Harlan Fork. It didn't appear on most maps. Pat had coordinates, but the roads weren't marked, and twice we had to back out of dead ends and try different turns. Devin made a joke about driving into a horror movie and Carl told him to shut up and Devin shut up. Harlan Fork was smaller than I expected. Maybe 30 houses arranged along a single unpaved road that ran beside a creek. The creek was low that time of year, barely moving, and the smell from it was something I noticed immediately, a faint mineral rot, like old copper pipes left in still water. Some of the houses had plastic sheeting over their windows instead of glass. Old cars sat in yards, some of them sinking slowly into the earth as if the ground was swallowing them. The people came out to meet us, which was unusual. In the other communities, we'd had to knock on doors and explain ourselves. Here they seemed to be waiting. A man named Harold met us at the edge of town. He was in his 70s with hands so large and knotted they looked like they'd been carved from oak. He shook my hand with a grip that I felt all the way up to my shoulder. His eyes were calm, entirely calm. The kind of calm that either means peace or means something has already happened to you that removed the capacity for fear. Harold walked us through the community without much ceremony. He answered Pat's questions about the water system with short, precise answers. Yes, they had a well. Yes, it had been tested. No, they didn't have access to county water lines. Yes, there was a storage tank. "Where's the storage tank?" Pat asked, pen moving across her clipboard. Harold pointed up the hill behind the houses to where a rusted water tower rose above the tree line. Even at a distance, I could see it was old, the kind of riveted steel construction they built in the 1940s. Legs buried in concrete pads that had cracked and heaved with decades of frost. It sat on a slight prominence above the tree line, and from where we stood, something about its silhouette bothered me. I couldn't say why. I put it aside. Harold offered to take Pat up the hill to inspect the tank. Devin volunteered to go along and take measurements. Carl and I stayed in the village and conducted our own walkthrough of the road infrastructure, which was my primary responsibility anyway. We spent about 2 hours going up and down the road, measuring culverts and bridge clearances over the creek, photographing cracked pavement and eroded shoulders. The residents watched us but kept their distance. A few of the older women smiled and nodded when we made eye contact. Children watched from doorways but didn't come out. I noticed there weren't many people between the ages of about 15 and 55. I assumed the same story as everywhere else they'd left for jobs. One older man sat on a chair outside what appeared to be a general store, though nothing in the window suggested it sold anything in particular. He was whittling a piece of wood into a shape I couldn't identify. As I passed, he looked up at me with pale, watery eyes. "You going up to the tower?" he asked. "My colleagues went up," I said. "I'm down here." He nodded and looked back at his whittling. "Good," he said quietly. "Better to stay down here." I stopped. "Is there a safety issue with the tower? Any structural concern we should know about?" The old man shook his head slowly. "No structural concern," he said. He said it with a small private smile, the way someone smiles at a joke that only they understand. "The tower's solid. Everything up there is solid. You just might not want to disturb it is all. Margaret doesn't like being disturbed." "Margaret?" I said. He said nothing more. Went back to his whittling. I wrote Margaret in my notebook for no reason I could explain and kept walking. Pat and Devon came back down the hill about 40 minutes later. Pat was efficient and businesslike as always, flipping through her notes and talking about water pressure readings. Devon was quiet, which was unusual for him. He kept looking back up the hill toward the tower. I pulled him aside while Pat talked to Carl. "You good?" I asked him. Devon was 23 years old with the kind of face that still looked surprised by things. He looked at me for a moment before answering. "There was someone in the tower," he said. "What do you mean, someone?" "When we were up there, Pat was taking her readings on the access port on the outside. I went around the other side to check the leg anchors. There's a ladder that goes up the inside through a hatch in the bottom. The hatch was open." He paused. "I could hear something moving around inside the tank." "Could have been an animal," I said. "Raccoons, possums, they get into things." "It wasn't an animal," he said. Then he stopped talking. I waited. "Devon." "I looked up through the hatch," he said. "Just for a second. It was dark inside and I only had my flashlight." He stopped again. "What did you see?" "I don't know," he said. "Something sitting up there above the waterline on a kind of ledge or shelf inside the tank, like a person, but not." He shook his head. "It was too still, not moving the way a person would sit, just folded up, like its joints didn't work the right direction." "Did it look at you?" Devon didn't answer immediately. "The eyes were open," he said. "That's all I know. The eyes were open and they were looking down at the hatch when I looked up. So either it was already looking at the hatch or it moved and looked when it heard me coming. I couldn't tell which." He exhaled. "I shut the hatch. I didn't say anything to Pat because I didn't want her to look and I didn't want to go back up there. I made a decision. I told Devon to stay with Pat and Carl and keep them occupied. Then I walked back to the old man with his whittling. "Margaret," I said. "Who is she?" He looked up without surprise, as if he'd known I'd come back. "She's been here a long time," he said. "Longer than any of the rest of us. My grandfather remembered her. Said she was here when he was born, and she didn't look any different from how she looks now. She keeps to herself mostly. Stays up in the tower. She likes the water." He paused. "We pipe fresh well water in regularly. She needs it." "She lives in the water tower," I said. "Has for as long as anyone can remember," he said. "She keeps the water clean. You might think that's strange, her living in it. But the water from this township has never made anyone sick. Not once. We had some outsiders come through about 15 years ago, inspectors like you, and they tested the water and said they'd never seen anything like it. Perfectly clean. Better than clean. Like the water was alive somehow." He smiled. "It is. She's in it." I stood there processing this. "Is she dangerous?" I asked. The old man looked at me directly. "Not to us," he said. "She never has been. But there was a time, maybe 12, 13 years back, we had some trouble with a group of men who came up here from the county seat. Didn't want people in Highland Fork applying for federal money. Thought they could scare us off our own land. 3 of them came up to the tower one night with intentions to damage it. Cause a contamination situation. Discredit the town." He paused. 2 of them ran. Came out of those woods running like I've never seen grown men run. Wouldn't say a word about what they'd seen. The 3rd one, he picked up his wood again. They found him in the creek the next morning. No marks on him, nothing broken, nothing missing, just dead. Medical examiner said it was a cardiac arrest. Man was 34 years old, healthy as a horse. The old man shrugged gently. She doesn't like to be threatened. None of us do. I went back to my team. Pat was wrapping up her assessment. I told her we had enough and we should head back to our temporary quarters in the county seat. She gave me a slightly puzzled look but didn't argue. Carl had no opinions, as usual. Devon looked relieved. We drove out of Harlan Fork in the late afternoon, the hills casting long shadows across the road. I watched the water tower in the rearview mirror until it disappeared behind the trees. That night, in the motel, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I went over what Devon had described and what the old man had told me. I turned it around in my mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking for the angle that makes it ordinary, looking for the explanation that fits inside the normal dimensions of the world. I couldn't find it. I'd grown up in a household where my grandmother talked about things she called old presences. She was from rural Georgia, and she'd grown up with stories about certain places that had been inhabited long before the people came. And some of those presences had stayed when the people arrived, and sometimes arrangements were made between what was old and what was new. I dismissed all of that as a boy. The army had given me frameworks in which outcomes were the result of inputs, problems had solutions, and the world operated according to physical law. Harlan Fork was asking me to consider that I had not, in fact, seen everything. On the 5th day, we visited the last 2 communities on our list. Standard assessments. We drove back to Fort Bragg and filed our reports. In my report on Harlan Fork, I noted that the water quality was exceptional, that the storage tower showed surface oxidation but appeared structurally sound, and that the community would benefit from connection to county infrastructure despite apparent self-sufficiency. I recommended they receive the federal funding they'd applied for. I didn't write about Margaret. 6 days later, the towers fell in New York and Washington, and every small, strange thing I'd ever encountered got swallowed by the size of what came after. My unit was on a transport to Afghanistan within the month, and Harlan Fork slipped to a back corner of my memory where it sat quiet for years. It was in 2018 that I went back. I don't know exactly why I went. I was retired by then, living in Virginia, and I'd driven to Kentucky to see an old army buddy who'd bought a farm outside of Lexington. On the drive back, I saw the exit for the county, and I took it. I told myself I was curious. I told myself it was just to see. The road into Harlan Fork was paved now, though barely. The creek looked the same. About half the houses were gone, collapsed or burned or simply removed, and the ones that remained were occupied, though the population had clearly shrunk further. But the water tower was still there. Exactly as I remembered it, rust and all, legs sunk into those cracked concrete pads. An elderly woman came out onto her porch when I parked. She didn't recognize me, of course. I asked if Harold was still around, and she shook her head and said Harold had passed in 2009. I asked if she'd grown up in Harlan Fork, and she said yes, her whole life. I asked about Margaret. The woman looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped down off her porch and came to stand at her gate, studying my face. "You've been here before," she said. It wasn't a question. 2001, I said, Army assessment. She nodded slowly. "You know, most people who come through don't ask about her. They look at the tower and they look at the water readings and they write their numbers down and they leave." She paused. "How'd you know to ask?" "Someone told me about her," I said. "Years ago. I never forgot it." The woman leaned on the fence post. "She's still there," she said quietly. "Still in the tank, same as always." She glanced up the hill at the tower with an expression that I can only describe as fond, the same look you'd give a grandparent's house. "There was a fellow about 2 years back," she said. "Real estate developer type. Wanted to buy the land, the whole hollow for some kind of resort project. Kept coming around, making offers, getting more aggressive each time. Last time he came, he went up the hill on his own. Don't know why, nobody told him to. He came back down running." She smiled thinly. "Never came back. Never sent anyone else either. We kept our land." I stood there looking at the tower for a minute. Then I looked at the woman. "What is she?" I asked. "What actually is she?" The woman thought about it, not like she was deciding whether to answer, but like she was genuinely trying to find the right words. "She's old," the woman finally said. "Older than the houses, older than the road, older than us being here. She was in the water when our people came. There was a spring on this land and she was in it. When we built on top of the spring, she came with it. She moved into the tank when we built the tower because that's where the water went." She paused. "My grandmother used to say she's not a ghost, she's not a demon. She's just something that lives in water the way bears live in forests. She was here first and she lets us be here and we let her be. On the drive home, I tried to put a rational frame around it. Failed, as I had in 2001. There are things in this world that have simply been here longer than our categories for them. We built our civilization and our taxonomies on top of a much older foundation, and sometimes in the forgotten places, in the hollows in the hills and the stretches of land that never made it onto the main roads, something from before is still there, underneath. I believe the water in Harlan Fork is clean because of her. I believe it without being able to prove it the same way the people of that town believe it, the way they believed it across generations they can no longer count. And I believe that whatever she is, this Margaret, this thing folded up in darkness above the waterline, patient as stone, old as the spring itself, she has made her arrangement with those people and she keeps it. She protects what is hers. I would not recommend testing that arrangement. I have seen things in war that stripped me of the comfortable illusion that human beings are the most dangerous thing in any given space. Margaret confirmed something I had already begun to suspect, that the world is considerably stranger than the people running it would like it to be. She is still up there, right now as I write this, waiting in the dark water, in the rusted tank, in those Kentucky hills. God help the next developer who goes up that hill alone. We continue. I'm not certain I know how to begin this properly, so I'll start the way I know best, with the facts, as best I can recall them. What I'm about to describe began in the fall of 2019, though in truth the origin of all of it goes back much further than that. It goes back to the afternoon of September 14th, 1999. That was the day my sister Lily died. She was 8 years old, I was 15. We lived on a rural property about 12 miles outside of Riddle, Oregon, a small timber town that most people have never heard of and probably never will. Our house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by Douglas fir on 3 sides, with a long, straight county road out front. By our standards, it was a quiet, safe kind of place. We left our bikes in the yard without locking them. We knew every neighbor by name. My father, Gary, was a house painter and handyman. He wasn't a man of many words, but he had a way of showing love through what he built with his hands. When Lily turned 8 that spring, he found an old Schwinn bicycle at a yard sale, stripped it down, and repainted it himself over 3 weekends in the garage. He chose fire engine red because that was Lily's favorite color. He wrapped the handlebars in white tape. He fixed a small silver bell to the left, grip the old-fashioned kind you pushed with your thumb, and then, in white enamel paint, using a stencil he'd cut from a cereal box, he painted her name on the frame in letters about 2 inches high just above the pedal crank, Lily. Lily cried when she saw it, the good kind of crying. She rode it up and down the driveway for an hour while my parents watched from the porch, and I watched from my bedroom window, because I was 15 and thought I was too old for that kind of thing. That bicycle became the most important object in her world. She rode it every afternoon, always on the gravel driveway or on the wide, flat shoulder of the county road, never on the pavement itself, which my father had strictly forbidden. On the afternoon of September 14th, my mother asked me to walk Lily down to the Kellerman's place about half a mile down the road where Lily was going to play with their granddaughter for a couple of hours. It was a walk we'd done dozens of times. The road was straight. You could see the Kellerman's mailbox from our front steps. I was in the middle of a video game. I told Lily to go on her own. She knew the way. She'd done it before. I told her to stay on the shoulder. She said okay, and went to get her bicycle. I went back to my game. 40 minutes later, our telephone rang. It was Mrs. Kellerman. She said Lily hadn't arrived and was she still coming. I told her Lily had left nearly half an hour ago. There was a silence on the line that I still think about sometimes, in the middle of the night. My father ran down the road while my mother called the police. I followed him, and I remember the sound of my sneakers on the gravel and the way the trees seemed to lean toward us as we ran. We found Lily's bicycle in the ditch about a quarter mile from our house. The front wheel was bent. The silver bell was still attached to the handlebar. She was 20 feet further down the road. The driver was a 19-year-old from Coos Bay. He'd drifted onto the shoulder while reaching for something on the passenger seat and never saw her. The police ruled it an accident. He wrote my parents a letter that sat on the kitchen table for 3 weeks after the funeral, and then one day it was gone, and no one ever mentioned it again. My father retrieved Lily's bicycle from the evidence yard the week after the funeral. He brought it back to the property and leaned it against the outside of the garage. He didn't look at it again for 2 days. On the third night, I remember this precisely because I couldn't sleep and was sitting in the dark of my room. I saw him carry the bicycle behind the equipment shed to where we had the burn barrel. I watched the orange glow appear above the roofline. I watched it for a long time. When it finally went dark, I heard him walk back to the house, and I heard him crying quietly as he passed my door. That was the last time I thought I would ever see that bicycle. The years that followed were not kind to my family. My mother found religion in the immediate aftermath and held onto it the way a drowning person holds onto a rope. My father became quieter with each passing year, like a fire slowly going out. He stopped taking painting jobs about 5 years after Lily died. He sat in front of the television more than he used to. He died of a stroke in his sleep in January of 2012 at 62 years old. He looked, by then, like a man of 80. My mother moved to Tucson not long after to be near her sister. I stayed in Oregon. I drifted through my 20s without much direction construction work, a brief stint in warehouse logistics, a few years doing deliveries for a medical supply company. I wasn't bad at any of it, and I wasn't particularly good at any of it. What I was consistently was alone, and comfortable enough with that to stop fighting it. By 2019, I was 35 years old and working as a night shift security supervisor at a cold storage distribution facility outside of Eugene. It was the kind of job that suited me. 12-hour shifts, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 3 nights on and 3 off. Largely solitary work, patrol the perimeter, check the loading bays, monitor the cameras, write the log. I had one colleague on nights, a woman named Marta who had been doing facility security for 11 years and had a talent for crossword puzzles and comfortable silence. I lived alone in a ground floor apartment about 14 miles from the facility, down a stretch of state highway that cut through farmland and timber country. I was not a man who believed in the supernatural. I want to be clear about that. I was pragmatic, almost to a fault. I'd never had a dream that meant anything, and I didn't believe in ghosts. I hadn't been inside a church since my father's funeral. And then October of 2019 arrived. It was a Thursday morning around 3:15 a.m. on October 9th. I was driving home after my shift, heading east on Highway 36, light rain coming down. My headlights cut through maybe 50 yards of wet asphalt ahead of me. There was no other traffic. I saw the bicycle at roughly 200 feet. It was on the right shoulder, and at first I assumed what anyone would assume: someone had left their bike on the roadside. But then it moved. Not fell over, not shifted. It was moving forward, along the shoulder, at maybe 5 miles an hour. And I could see, in the beam of my headlights, a small figure sitting on it. A child. My foot came off the gas immediately. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I slowed to 15 miles an hour, then 10, telling myself a child on a country road at 3 a.m. in the rain was impossible, was some kind of mistake, that my eyes were doing something my brain couldn't yet process. When I was about 60 feet behind them, the figure vanished. Not gradually, not by turning onto a driveway. They were there, and then they weren't. The bicycle was still visible for a half-second longer, red paint bright in my headlights, and then it was gone too, just the empty wet road ahead of me. I pulled over and sat with my hazard lights blinking. Then I got out. I walked back to where I'd seen it and shone my phone's flashlight into the drainage ditch and along the fence line. Nothing. No bicycle, no child, no tracks in the soft mud along the shoulder. I drove home and told myself it had been a microsleep. I told myself the rain and the dark had done something to my perception. I did not sleep that morning. 14 days later, I saw it again. It was 1 a.m. on October 23rd. I was walking the exterior perimeter of the facility, something I did every 90 minutes, when I came around the rear corner of Building B and stopped. There was a bicycle leaning against the exterior wall, just beside the loading dock door. Red frame, white handlebar tape. I keyed my radio and told Marta there was an unauthorized bicycle on the exterior of Building B, then walked the full fence line checking every gate. Every padlock was secured, every section of chain link was intact. When I came back around to the loading dock, the bicycle was gone. Marta came to find me. She said I looked like I'd seen a ghost, which I've come to think was more accurate than she intended. I told her I must have imagined it. She accepted that without argument and went back to the camera station. I called my mother 2 days later. She was living alone in Tucson, and I tried to call every couple of weeks, though I wasn't always reliable about it. She sounded distant when she answered. I asked if she was sleeping all right, and she paused for a long moment before saying she'd been having strange dreams. About Lily. I asked her to describe them. She said they were mostly pleasant, which I found more unsettling than if she'd said they were nightmares. Lily walking in a meadow, Lily laughing, Lily on her bicycle riding down a road that shone like water in the sun. I told her to rest and that I'd call again soon. After I hung up, I called my cousin Derek, who lives in Denver and who was 11 years old the last time he saw Lily alive. He'd been visiting us that week, playing in the yard, and he remembered everything about that day with the same indelible clarity as I did. Derek and I weren't close, exactly, but we were connected in the way people are when they've shared something they can never fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. He told me he'd found old family photographs while clearing out a storage closet, pictures of Lily with the bicycle that I'd never seen. He'd already mailed me one. The photo arrived on a Friday. A 4x6 print, slightly overexposed the way outdoor photos from the late 90s always looked. Lily, 8 years old, squinting into the sun, both hands on the handlebars of the red bicycle, her feet flat on the driveway gravel, white handlebar tape, small silver bell on the left grip, and there on the frame, clearly visible in the afternoon light, in white paint letters, Lily. I stood in my kitchen holding that photograph for a long time. Then I pinned it to the refrigerator with a magnet and went to bed. I lay awake for 4 hours. 3 weeks later, I woke in the early afternoon to a sound I couldn't immediately identify. A faint rhythmic clicking coming from outside, metallic, steady. I lay still for a moment listening, then told myself it was a neighbor's wind chime or something loose on a car in the parking lot. I went to the window anyway. The red bicycle was leaning against the iron railing of my front steps. I stood at the window for a long time. The bicycle didn't move. No one else was visible in the parking lot. It was a still, gray November afternoon with no wind. I went outside. Up close, it was exactly as I remembered it. Fire engine red, white handlebar tape, small silver bell on the left grip. My hand moved to the frame almost before I decided to move it. I turned the bicycle toward me and read the letters. Lily, white enamel, same 2-inch stencil. I don't know how long I stood there, long enough for my feet to go cold on the concrete. Then I called Derek. He answered on the second ring, and before I could say anything, he said, "Owen, something strange is happening here too." He'd seen a red bicycle outside his apartment building in Denver. 3 times in 2 weeks, always in the evening, always near the entrance, always gone before he could get to it. He hadn't called me because he thought he was losing his mind. He thought it was guilt. He thought it was grief, finally surfacing after 20 years underground. I told him I was looking at it right now, in my parking lot. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. The following weekend, I drove 2 hours north to visit my father's sister, Patricia, who is 71 years old and lives alone in a small house in Cottage Grove. I hadn't seen her in over a year, but she opened the door like she'd been expecting me, put on coffee without asking, and sat down across from me at her kitchen table. I told her everything. The highway, the perimeter fence, the parking lot, the bicycle against my front railing with Lily's name on it. I told her about Derek. I told her about my mother's dreams. Patricia listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her mug. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked me one question. Did I know how our grandfather had come to own the land the property in Riddle was built on? I said I didn't know much about it. She told me our grandfather had been part of a timber consortium in the early 1950s that logged an old-growth parcel belonging to a local family that had farmed it for 3 generations. The consortium had challenged the family's title in court and won on a technicality. The family had been driven off with almost nothing. There had been an elderly woman in that family who stood in the road as the equipment came in and said things that the logging crew talked about for years afterward. Not threats, something more formal than threats. Patricia said she herself had seen something in her own house twice over the past several years. A shape near the hallway at night, a feeling of being watched from the corners of rooms. She kept rosaries on every windowsill. She'd never mentioned it to anyone because she hadn't wanted to frighten them and because she had no proof. She looked at me steadily and said, "It finds what you love most and then it wears it." I drove home in the dark and thought about that sentence the entire way back. 9 days later, I was on shift. Early November, a Tuesday, 3 a.m. I was doing my interior rounds, building A, then B, then the connecting loading corridor. Cold storage facilities are loud in their own way, even when they're empty. The hum of refrigeration units, the deep vibration of compressors, the occasional mechanical clank from somewhere inside the walls. I pushed open the door to the main loading bay of Building B and stopped walking. The bicycle was in the center of the floor. The loading bay was about 60 feet wide and lit by overhead fluorescent panels. The bicycle sat in the middle of it, red paint vivid under the white light, front wheel turned slightly to the left, as though it was waiting to make a turn. I stood in the doorway and looked at it the way you look at something when your brain hasn't finished deciding what it is yet. Then the bell rang, once clearly in the quiet between the hum of the refrigeration units. A single, clean, bright note, the exact sound I remembered from childhood, from Lily pushing that thumb lever over and over in our driveway. Then a second time, I walked toward it. I can't fully explain why. Every rational part of me said to step back, lock the door, call Martha on the radio, but I walked toward it slowly, the way you move in a dream when you understand you can't stop yourself. My phone rang. The number on the screen was a 541 area code, Southern Oregon, but not one I recognized. I answered it. There was breathing on the line, slow and quiet. Then a sound that stopped me walking entirely. A child's voice, humming. 3 or 4 bars of a melody I identified immediately because I had heard it 1,000 times growing up. It was the lullaby my mother used to sing at bedtime. A simple tune, not from a book or a record, something she'd made up herself. Something that existed nowhere on earth except in our house, between those 4 walls, in those particular years. I hadn't heard that melody in 30 years. I knew every note. The lights went out, all of them, simultaneously. The loading bay, the corridor behind me, the emergency strips along the baseboard, total darkness, the kind that has physical weight to it. The refrigeration hum continued, which was the only thing that kept me from believing I'd gone completely blind. I stood in the dark and held my phone, and I don't know how long it lasted. It might have been 20 seconds, it might have been 5 minutes. When the lights came back on, the bicycle was gone. On the concrete floor, in the exact spot where it had stood, there was a small silver bell, the old-fashioned thumb-push kind. The rubber grip on the mount was cracked and faded. I bent down and picked it up. It was cold in a way that was different from the ambient temperature of the building cold, the way metal gets when it's been left outside in winter for a very long time. My phone rang again. This time the screen said Derek. He said my name twice before I could respond. His voice was unsteady. Owen, it's your mom. She fell. She had been found on her kitchen floor by a neighbor who came to return a dish. My mother was conscious when the paramedics arrived. She'd broken her hip and fractured her wrist from catching herself on the counter. The doctor said she was fortunate, all things considered. Derek flew to Tucson the next morning and I met him there the following day. My mother was in a hospital bed, smaller than I remembered, looking at the ceiling. When I sat beside her and took her hand, she looked at me for a long moment and then said very quietly, I was dreaming about Lily. She said in the dream, Lily was at the end of a long road, standing next to the red bicycle, waving at her. My mother said she started walking toward her, and the closer she got, the further away Lily seemed until everything went dark and she felt herself falling. She remembered nothing after that until she was in the ambulance. Derek and I sat with her and didn't say much. Later, in the hospital corridor, Derek told me he hadn't seen the bicycle in Denver since the night of my mother's fall, not once. I told him about the loading bay, the lights, the humming on the phone, the bell. I showed him the bell. He held it and looked at it for a long time and handed it back without speaking. He'd brought more photographs from the box he'd found while organizing his storage unit. Ordinary family photos, mostly holidays and birthdays and backyard afternoons. But he'd set one aside specifically to show me. A photo from the summer of 1999, 3 months before Lily died. A Sunday afternoon in our yard, Lily and Derek playing near the driveway, my father visible in the background by the garage. In the tree line behind the back fence, barely visible, there was a dark shape. It wasn't a shadow, the light was wrong for that. It wasn't an animal. It had a vertical quality to it, almost upright, standing just at the point where the trees became dark enough to conceal. Derek said he'd noticed it immediately when he found the photo, and that he'd told himself it was damage on the print, or a trick of the film. I told him I didn't think it was either of those things. I left that job 3 months later, not because of what happened in the loading bay. I left because my mother needed help through her recovery, and I needed to be closer to her. I moved to Tucson in the spring of 2020 into an apartment 2 miles from hers. I helped her with groceries and medical appointments and physical therapy twice a week. Slowly she got stronger. I still have the silver bell. It sits in the glove compartment of my car, wrapped in a piece of cloth. I haven't heard it ring since that November night in Building B. I don't entirely know why I've kept it, except that it feels wrong to throw it away like discarding evidence before anyone has understood what it proves. My Aunt Patricia is still alive, still keeps her rosaries on every windowsill, and when I call her she always sounds steady, the way people sound when they've made a careful long-standing peace with something they know is still out there. My mother doesn't talk about her dreams anymore. Derek put the photographs in a storage unit and we both agreed, without ever quite saying so, that some objects carry more than memory. What I know now that I didn't know in the fall of 2019 is that whatever followed my family, whatever latched onto our grief and worked its way through it year by year, it was patient. It had been patient for a long time. It didn't come at us with anything foreign. It didn't come with something we could refuse. It came dressed as the thing we couldn't stop loving. It came wearing my sister's name, painted on the frame of a bicycle that should have been ash for 20 years. I used to be the kind of man who believed only in what he could see and measure and explain. I'm not that man anymore. I won't pretend to miss him. What I will say, and I say this as someone who has stood alone in a dark loading bay and heard that bell ring in the silence, and who picked up a piece of cold metal from a concrete floor where there had been nothing a moment before, is that whatever it is, it knew exactly what it was doing. It didn't make a mistake in choosing what it chose. It found the wound that never healed and pressed against it gently, the way you test a door before you decide whether to open it. Some nights, when I'm driving alone and the road ahead is dark and empty and the rain is coming down, I think I see something at the edge of my headlights, a flash of red, a small shape moving along the shoulder. I keep my hands on the wheel. I keep driving. I don't look back.